In mid-July 1944, the Soviet First Ukrainian Front, commanded by Marshal Ivan Konev, prepared for a strategic offensive aimed at driving German forces from western Ukraine into eastern Poland. This planning occurred during a pivotal moment. Concurrent to Operation Bagration in the north, the Lviv-Sandomierz operation would serve a complementary purpose, drawing German mobile reserves southward and weakening Army Group Center's ability to respond. In the weeks leading up to July, Konev's command massed a formidable force. Strength on 1st July included approximately 2,200 men, nearly 2,050 armored fighting vehicles, and more than 11,000 artillery pieces. For the Soviet leadership, its capture of Lviv and advance to the Vistula River would sever German lines of communication between Ukraine, eastern Poland, and the southern sectors. Recapturing Lviv, taken first by Soviet forces in 1939 and reoccupied since German invasion, had symbolic resonance and would open the path toward Central Europe. Military readiness on both sides reflected this significance. Soviet forces benefited from recent successes and high morale, having been on the offensive for nearly a year. Their force concentration presented a ratio of roughly 2 Soviet soldiers for each German defender. Conversely, German forces, though managing significant rear and flank deployments, lacked comparable depth and were dispersed across multiple fronts. Public sentiment within the Soviet Union was shaped by propaganda that heralded the operation as one of the Stalin's 10 blows, reinforcing the narrative of liberation and forward momentum. Among the local populations, especially in western Ukraine and eastern Poland, expectations varied. Some viewed the Soviets as liberators, others as new occupiers, but verifiable data on civilian reactions remains limited. In terms of intelligence and preparation, the Soviets executed maskirovka, operational deception, to conceal their buildup southward, directly influencing German reserve allocations and reducing reinforcements to Army Group Center. German intelligence, in contrast, underestimated the scale of the Soviet forces and failed to anticipate such a concentrated assault from the south. This miscalculation would prove significant as the offensive commenced. Thus, the conditions on 13th July 1944 were set. A well-prepared Soviet command structure, numerical and materiel superiority, and strategically targeted objectives formed the basis for an operation that would shape the course of the Eastern Front. The stage was now set for the opening of the offensive. The Lviv-Sandomierz offensive opened on 13th July 1944, with coordinated assaults across a broad sector of the front, stretching from the Carpathians in the south to the Bug River in the north. The First Ukrainian Front launched its initial strikes with concentrated artillery barrages lasting up to 2 hours, aimed at neutralizing German forward positions, destroying communication lines, and disrupting command structures. The main Soviet thrusts were delivered by the 3rd Guards Tank Army under General Pavel Rybalko and the 1st Guards Tank Army under General Mikhail Katukov, supported by massed infantry formations and aviation from the 2nd Air Army. The initial focus was on breaking through the defensive positions of the German 10th Army Corps and LVI Panzer Corps, which were anchored by fortified localities and minefields. Soviet infantry divisions, moving under artillery cover, advanced in multiple echelons to sustain momentum and exploit any gaps created by tank units were held in readiness behind the front to move through once the infantry had secured breaches in the first defensive belt. In several sectors, assault engineers cleared minefields and obstacles under fire to allow armored formations forward. German defenders, under the overall command of General Oberst Joseph Harp, reacted swiftly to the Soviet assault. Mobile reserves, including elements of the 16th and 17th Panzer Divisions, were committed to counterattack and delay Soviet breakthroughs. In the early days, these armored counterblows slowed the Soviet advance in certain areas, particularly near Brody, where German tanks engaged in prolonged duels with Soviet armor. However, the disparity in numbers and the overwhelming artillery support available to the Soviets began to tell, forcing German units into gradual withdrawal. The Luftwaffe sought to disrupt Soviet operations through concentrated airstrikes on bridgeheads, supply columns, and armored spearheads. However, Soviet air superiority was evident from the outset. The Second Air Army flew hundreds of sorties daily, targeting German artillery positions, troop concentrations, and transport routes. This aerial dominance limited the ability of German forces to regroup and made it difficult for them to mount sustained counteroffensives. By 15th of July, the Soviet spearheads had advanced between 10 and 15 kilometers in several sectors, capturing forward German positions and forcing a reorganization of the defensive line. Localities such as Horokhiv and Radekiv became scenes of intense fighting, with Soviet units systematically reducing fortified buildings and strongpoints. Civilian populations in these areas were caught in the crossfire, with many displaced as the front passed through. Commanders on both sides began adjusting to the unfolding situation. Soviet High Command recognized that German forces were attempting to orders were issued to accelerate the pace of the offensive in the northern and southern sectors to outflank this concentration. The Germans, aware of the threat of encirclement, sought to hold the Brody sector as long as possible to allow an organized withdrawal from Lviv. The opening phase thus established the operational pattern of the offensive: heavy artillery preparation, rapid exploitation by armored and mechanized units, and relentless pressure on German positions to prevent coherent defensive regrouping. The Soviet command's ability to sustain this tempo would determine the speed and scope of the advance toward the Vistula and the road to Berlin. Strategic planning for the continuation of the Lviv-Sandomierz offensive centered on exploiting the initial breaches achieved in mid-July 1944 and converting them into deep penetration. The Soviet First Ukrainian Front's objectives were clear: destroy the bulk of Army Group North Ukraine's forces west of the Bug River, liberate Lviv, and advance to the Vistula River to secure bridgeheads for future operations into central Poland. Stavka directives emphasized speed, coordinated use of mechanized formations, and deep envelopment maneuvers to prevent the Germans from retreating in good order. Marshal Ivan Konev structured his forces for multiple converging thrusts. In the north, the 13th and 60th Armies were to advance toward Lublin and encircle German forces positioned around Brody. In the center, the 38th Army and the 3rd Guards Tank Army aimed directly at Lviv, with orders to bypass heavy resistance where possible and drive rapidly into the city's approaches. In the south, the 1st Guards Tank Army and the 18th Army were to push toward the Carpathian foothills. The German strategic goal was to hold a coherent defensive line long enough to withdraw valuable units to the west, preserving combat strength for the defense of Poland and the approaches to Germany. General Oberst Josef Harp's Army Group North Ukraine relied on fortified positions, mobile counterattacks by panzer divisions, and the difficult terrain of rivers, forests, and urban areas to slow the Soviet advance. The Brody-Lviv sector became the focal point of German defense, with the 13th Army Corps positioned to absorb the main blow. Logistics played a decisive role in the planning phase. The Soviets had concentrated substantial supplies of ammunition, fuel, and rations in forward depots before the offensive, allowing for sustained high-intensity operations. Armored formations. German logistics were under severe strain. Supply lines were under constant attack from Soviet aircraft and partisans, and fuel shortages restricted the mobility of panzer reserves. The loss of rail hubs during the first days of the offensive further complicated German resupply. Doctrinally, the Soviets intended to employ deep battle principles, using successive echelons of troops to maintain unbroken momentum. Initial rifle army assaults would fix and wear down German defenses, after which tank and mechanized corps would exploit breakthroughs, penetrate to operational depth, and encircle major enemy groupings. The Germans adhered to a doctrine of flexible defense, counterattacking into Soviet flanks when possible, then falling back to prepared positions to delay the advance. Propaganda supported military aims on both sides. Soviet publications and radio broadcasts framed the offensive as a liberation of Ukrainian and Polish lands from German occupation, intended to boost morale among troops and civilians alike. Leaflets and loudspeaker messages were directed at enemy soldiers to encourage surrender. German propaganda emphasized the defense of Europe against Soviet expansion, portraying the battle as a struggle to protect German civilians and allies in Poland and Hungary. By 17th July, both commands had adjusted their plans in response to unfolding events. Soviet reconnaissance identified German attempts to form a defensive bulwark around Brody, prompting Stavka to accelerate the envelopment from the north and south. The Germans, recognizing the danger, began pulling units from less threatened sectors to reinforce the Brody pocket. This strategic realignment on both sides set the stage for a decisive clash that would determine the fate of Army Group North Ukraine and open the way to the Vistula. The first major engagements of the Lviv-Sandomierz offensive unfolded between 18 and 20 July 1944, when Soviet forces began closing on the German defensive concentrations around Brody and advancing on the approaches to Lviv. The Soviet 13th and 60th Armies attacked from the north, aiming to cut the main supply and withdrawal routes, while the 3rd Guards Tank Army and 38th Army pressed from the east toward the city. In the south, the 1st Guards Tank Army advanced rapidly through less heavily fortified terrain, threatening to envelop German positions from the southwest. The Brody sector quickly became the center of fierce fighting. The German 13th Army Corps, consisting of several infantry divisions and reinforced by elements of the 16th and 17th Panzer Divisions, had fortified its positions with interconnected trench systems, anti-tank obstacles, and minefields. Soviet artillery preparation was intense, with thousands of shells falling on German positions in a matter of hours. The opening barrages targeted known strongpoints, command posts, and artillery batteries, aiming to disorient the defenders before the infantry assault. Following the bombardment, rifle divisions advanced in dense formations, supported by close armor and self-propelled guns. German defenders responded with well-coordinated counterattacks. Panzer units emerged from concealed positions to strike Soviet spearheads, often forcing them to deploy defensively and slowing the advance. In several sectors, Soviet gains were measured in only hundreds of meters per day. As minefields and determined resistance, however, the pressure on the German flanks began to tell. Soviet mechanized corps operating south of Brody captured several key road junctions, cutting into the lateral movement of German reserves. Further west, the approaches to Lviv were contested by the 38th Army, whose formations engaged in bitter fighting for control of fortified villages and river crossings. The Germans had fortified bridgeheads along the Poltva and Bug rivers, turning natural barriers into defensive lines. Soviet engineers worked under fire to construct pontoon bridges and repair damaged crossings, enabling armored units to push forward in support of the infantry. The combination of artillery barrages, coordinated infantry assaults, and flanking maneuvers gradually forced German units to yield ground. The civilian population in these contested areas faced severe hardships. Villages were evacuated or destroyed. Some civilians were pressed into labor for building fortifications or repairing roads. The rapid changes in control of territory led to food shortages as supply chains for the local population collapsed. By 20th July, the Soviet encirclement of Brody was nearly complete. The northern and southern pincers were within striking distance of closing the gap behind the German 10th Army Corps. Soviet reconnaissance reported that German attempts to withdraw westward were being disrupted by constant airstrikes from the 2nd Air Army, which targeted convoys and bridgeheads. The Luftwaffe, though active, was unable to contest Soviet air superiority effectively, and suffered losses that reduced its capacity to intervene in ground battles. The first phase of heavy engagements confirmed the Soviet ability to sustain pressure along multiple axes while isolating key German formations. The encirclement at Brody, if completed, promised to destroy a significant portion of Army Group North Ukraine's combat strength. For the Germans, the priority became holding open a corridor for retreat while delaying the Soviet advance toward Lviv and the Vistula River. The operational situation was now moving toward a decisive test of maneuver and endurance. Between 21 and 24 July 1944, the battle entered a phase of escalation as the Soviet First Ukrainian Front committed additional forces to seal the encirclement around Brody and push toward Lviv. The northern arm of the pincer, formed by the 13th and 60th Armies, linked up with elements of the 1st Guards Tank Army advancing from the south, effectively cutting off the German 10th Army Corps. Inside the pocket were 8 German divisions, including the 8th and 14th Waffen-SS divisions, the 361st and 349th Infantry divisions, and remnants of panzer and security units. Estimates of the encircled force ranged between 35,000 and 40,000 men. Soviet forces immediately tightened the ring, occupying surrounding villages and dominating the main escape routes with artillery. The 2nd Air Army maintained constant pressure from the air, striking supply dumps, troop concentrations, and attempted breakout formations. German commanders inside the pocket organized defensive perimeters, concentrating armor and artillery at potential breakthrough points. But shortages of fuel and ammunition quickly became critical. The Luftwaffe attempted air supply operations, but Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft fire disrupted most missions, and the quantities delivered were insufficient for sustained resistance. Meanwhile, Soviet advances outside the pocket gained momentum. The 38th Army moved closer to the eastern out. In the south, the 1st Guards Tank Army penetrated into the open terrain near Sambir, threatening to bypass Lviv entirely and advance toward the San River. This maneuver forced German High Command to divert reserves from the north to protect withdrawal routes into Poland, further weakening the defense of the encircled 10th Army Corps. The fighting within the Brody pocket intensified as Soviet forces launched coordinated assaults from multiple directions. Artillery bombardments were followed by infantry attacks supported by tanks and assault guns, aiming to reduce the pocket in stages. German units conducted desperate counterattacks to regain high ground or reopen roads, but each success was short-lived, as many had fled before the encirclement was completed, but those remaining faced bombardment, destruction of homes, and severe shortages of food and medical care. The collapse of local administration meant that survival depended on whatever could be scavenged or bartered. By 24th July, Soviet forces had compressed the pocket to a few kilometers in diameter. Communications between the trapped divisions and Army Group North Ukraine became sporadic, with messages reporting dwindling supplies and mounting casualties. German command outside the pocket debated whether to commit significant reserves to a relief operation, but the rapid Soviet advance elsewhere and the risk of further encirclements made large-scale rescue efforts impractical. At this stage, the offensive had achieved one of its key operational objectives: the destruction of a substantial portion of German combat strength in western Ukraine. The fall of the Brody pocket would free Soviet forces to concentrate on capturing Lviv and pushing toward the Vistula River. For the Germans, the loss would mean a severe reduction in available forces to defend the southern approaches to Poland, accelerating the collapse of their Eastern Front positions. From 25 to 28 July 1944, the Soviet First Ukrainian Front concentrated its efforts on completing the destruction of the Brody pocket, while simultaneously launching full-scale operations to seize Lviv. Inside the encirclement, the German 3rd Army Corps faced continuous Soviet assaults, supported by concentrated artillery fire and close air support. Soviet infantry, advancing in coordinated waves, attacked from multiple directions to divide the pocket into smaller segments, preventing the defenders from massing their remaining combat power. The 3rd Guards Tank Army and 60th Army pressed from the north and east, while the 1st Guards Tank Army and 38th Army closed in from the south and west. German forces within the pocket, numbering between 35,000 and 40,000 at the outset, attempted several breakout operations. On 26 July, a concentrated thrust involving elements of the 14th Waffen-SS Division and remnants of the 361st Infantry Division briefly broke through Soviet forward positions toward the northwest. However, Soviet reserves quickly countered, sealing the gap and inflicting heavy losses. Similar attempts on the following days failed under heavy artillery and aerial bombardment. shortages of fuel reduced the mobility of German armor, limiting the ability to coordinate breakouts with infantry movements. By 28th July, organized German resistance within the pocket had largely collapsed. Soviet forces captured thousands of prisoners, including senior officers of the 13th Army Corps, along with significant quantities of abandoned equipment, tanks, artillery pieces, motor vehicles, and ammunition stocks. Estimates indicate that fewer than 5,000 German troops managed to escape in small groups, many without heavy weapons. The loss of the Brody Pocket eliminated a major defensive formation of Army Group North Ukraine and removed a substantial armored reserve from German control in the sector. While the pocket was being reduced, Soviet forces to the west advanced rapidly toward Lviv. The 38th Army engaged in heavy street fighting on the eastern outskirts by 26 July, encountering determined German rearguards that used fortified buildings, barricades, and prepared firing positions. The 1st Guards Tank Army maneuvered to envelop the city from the south, cutting road and rail connections toward the Carpathians and preventing reinforcement from Hungarian units stationed farther west. The 3rd Guards Tank Army pushed north of Lviv to block escape routes toward the San River. Lviv's defense was organized by remnants of several German divisions withdrawn from previous positions, reinforced by police and auxiliary units. Despite the depletion of manpower and equipment, the defenders fought to delay the Soviet entry, using the urban terrain to their advantage. Soviet commanders sought to avoid prolonged house-to-house combat where possible, applying heavy artillery and airstrikes against strongpoints before advancing. On 27 July, coordinated attacks from multiple directions breached the main defensive lines. By evening, Soviet and Czechoslovak units had entered the central districts, capturing key administrative buildings and transportation hubs. Sporadic resistance continued into the next day, but organized German defense ceased as remaining troops withdrew or were captured. The liberation of Lviv was announced on 27 July, marking a significant milestone in the offensive. The dual success of eliminating the Brody Pocket and capturing Lviv within days created a major gap in the German front. Soviet forces now had an open route toward the Vistula River, with the potential to secure bridgeheads deep in enemy-held territory. For the Germans, the loss of both the city and a large portion of their combat forces in the sector meant that defensive operations in southern Poland would have to be conducted under severe manpower and equipment shortages, setting the stage for the next decisive phase of the campaign. Following the capture of Lviv at the end of July 1944, the Soviet First Ukrainian Front moved quickly to adapt its operational plans for the next stage of the Lviv-Sandomierz offensive. The destruction of the Brody Pocket and the fall of Lviv had opened a wide operational gap in the German front, and Marshal Konev sought to exploit this by advancing rapidly toward the Vistula River before the enemy could establish new defensive positions. The strategic aim now was to seize and hold bridgeheads on the western bank of the Vistula in the Sandomierz area, creating a forward base for future operations into central Poland and, ultimately, toward Berlin. The main Soviet strike groups for this phase were the 3rd Guards Tank Army, the 1st Guards Tank Army, and the 13th and 60th Armies, supported by the 5th Guards Army and 4th Tank Army. These formations were ordered to advance along converging axes toward the Vistula, with armored and mechanized corps in the lead to maintain momentum. Infantry armies followed to secure flanks, hold captured ground, and eliminate isolated enemy forces bypassed in the rapid advance. The 2nd Air Army provided continuous reconnaissance and close support, targeting German columns attempting to regroup in southern Poland. For the Germans, the priority was to halt the Soviet advance before it reached the Vistula. Army Group North Ukraine, now severely weakened, reorganized its remaining units along successive defensive lines in the Tarnów-Kielce-Sandomierz sector. Reinforcements were brought in from Army Group Center and from reserves stationed in central Poland, including elements of the 16th and 17th Panzer Divisions and infantry divisions transferred from quieter fronts. The new defensive strategy relied on using rivers, urban centers, and prepared positions to slow the Soviet advance, buying time for more substantial defenses to be built behind the Vistula. Despite these efforts, the speed of the Soviet advance proved difficult to counter. In the first days of August, the 3rd Guards Tank Army crossed the San River in multiple locations, capturing key crossings before German demolition teams could destroy them. The 1st Guards Tank Army advanced through Yarosław and Przemyśl, bypassing strong points and leaving them to be cleared by following infantry units. German rear guards, often composed of small combined arms detachments, attempted to delay the Soviet armor with anti-tank ambushes and controlled demolitions of bridges, but these measures had only temporary effect. The logistical demands of the rapid pursuit were significant. Soviet supply columns had to operate over increasingly long lines of communication, often along roads damaged by combat or clogged with retreating enemy traffic and displaced civilians. Fuel shortages occasionally slowed armored spearheads, forcing them to pause while supplies caught up. The Red Army's logistical services responded by using captured German fuel stocks and repairing rail lines to shorten delivery routes. German logistics were under even greater strain as the rapid Soviet advance disrupted their railway network and forced them to rely on limited road transport under constant air attack. Partisan activity also played a role in this phase. Soviet-aligned resistance groups in occupied Poland provided intelligence on German troop movements and conducted sabotage operations against railway lines and bridges. These actions further hampered German efforts to establish coherent defensive positions ahead of the Vistula. By mid-August, Soviet spearheads had reached the eastern bank of the Vistula in the Sandomierz area. Forward elements began immediate preparations to cross the river, recognizing that seizing bridgeheads before the Germans could reinforce the stage was set for one of the most critical and challenging operations of the entire offensive, forcing the Vistula and holding ground west of it against determined German counterattacks. This would test both the endurance of Soviet troops after weeks of continuous advance and the ability of German forces to mount effective resistance after repeated defeats. The crossing of the Vistula River in the Sandomierz area began in mid-August 1944 and marked the turning point of the final phase of the Lviv-Sandomierz offensive. The Soviet First Ukrainian Front understood that securing a firm bridgehead on the western bank was critical not only for the continuation of operations toward central Poland, but also for establishing a springboard for the eventual advance into Germany. German command, recognizing the same, rushed reinforcements to the sector. The initial crossings were carried out by forward detachments of the 5th Guards Army and the 13th Army. On 1–2 August, reconnaissance and assault units crossed the river using boats, rafts, and improvised means under the cover of artillery and smoke screens. Engineers quickly followed to establish pontoon bridges capable of supporting infantry and light vehicles. By 3rd August, several battalions were firmly established on the western bank near the towns of Baranov, Sandomierski, and Sandomierz itself. These forward positions were immediately subjected to German artillery fire and counterattacks, but Soviet troops repelled them, holding on to narrow strips of territory along the bank. Marshal Konev reinforced the bridgehead rapidly, committing elements of the 3rd Guards Tank Army and 4th Tank Army across newly constructed pontoon. By 5th August, the Soviet bridgehead had widened to more than 20 kilometers and extended 8 to 10 kilometers in depth. The rapid influx of armor gave the Soviets a significant advantage in repelling immediate German assaults. The German response was swift and determined. Army Group North Ukraine, now under pressure along the entire front, committed some of its most capable units to destroy the bridgehead. These included the 16th and 17th Panzer Divisions, the elite 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandart, and the 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf. Over several days in early August, these formations launched repeated counterattacks, often involving dozens of tanks, supported by infantry and self-propelled guns. The fighting was intense, with Soviet and German armor clashing at close range in fields and villages west of the river. Soviet defensive tactics in the bridgehead relied on depth and flexibility. Anti-tank gun lines were established in layers, supported by artillery firing from the eastern bank. Mobile reserves of tanks and mechanized infantry were held back to strike at German penetrations. The 2nd Air Army provided continuous air cover and ground attack missions, targeting German tank concentrations and supply convoys moving toward the battle area. Despite heavy losses on both sides, the Soviet position held. By mid-August, the bridgehead had expanded further, reaching dimensions of approximately 40 kilometers in width and up to 12–15 kilometers in depth. The Germans had failed to dislodge the Soviets despite committing significant forces and suffering heavy casualties in both personnel and equipment. The fighting consumed German reserves that might otherwise have been used to bolster defenses elsewhere on the Eastern Front. The establishment and defense of the Sandomierz bridgehead marked a decisive shift in the operational balance. For the Soviets, it provided a forward base for future offensives into southern Poland and beyond. For the Germans, it represented the loss of a key defensive line along the Vistula and a foothold for Soviet forces west of the river that could not be eliminated despite repeated efforts. The stage was now set for the next critical decisions that would determine whether this bridgehead could be transformed into the launching point for the final drive toward Berlin. By late August 1944, the Sandomierz bridgehead had become one of the most fiercely contested sectors on the Eastern Front. The Soviet First Ukrainian Front having secured a foothold west of the Vistula, now focused on expanding and reinforcing it to withstand sustained German counteroffensives. Marshal Konev prioritized the rapid construction of fortifications inside. The engineers worked around the clock to improve pontoon bridges and lay additional crossings to facilitate the constant flow of reinforcements, ammunition, and fuel from the eastern bank. German command, unwilling to accept the loss of the West Bank in this sector, launched a major counteroffensive on 11th August aimed at collapsing the bridgehead before it could be further reinforced. The operation was spearheaded by 4 panzer divisions, including the 16th and 17th Panzer Divisions, supported by heavy tanks from the 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion, equipped with Tiger IIs. This was one of the first large-scale combat deployments of these heavy tanks on the Eastern Front. German forces sought to split the bridgehead in two, destroy Soviet armor inside, and force the remaining units back across the river. The German assault began with intense artillery and mortar bombardments, followed by armored thrusts toward the villages of Studzianki and Ogledow, which were key to controlling the road network inside the bridgehead. In the opening engagements, German Tiger IIs demonstrated formidable firepower, knocking out Soviet T-34-85s at long range. However, their limited mobility and mechanical issues soon became apparent. Soviet anti-tank units, using concealed positions and massed fire from 76mm and 85mm guns, scored hits that disabled or destroyed several of the heavy tanks. In one notable encounter near Ogledow, Soviet tank crews ambushed and destroyed multiple Tiger IIs by exploiting their slow maneuvering in confined terrain. Soviet defense combined static and mobile elements. While rifle divisions held fortified lines against infantry assaults, tank brigades executed counterattacks against German penetrations, aiming to isolate and eliminate attacking spearheads before they could consolidate gains. Artillery from both sides pounded suspected assembly areas and crossroads, turning the countryside into a continuous battlefield. The Second Air Army maintained pressure on German rear areas, targeting fuel dumps and transport columns, further complicating the resupply of the attacking formations. After more than a week of heavy fighting, German forces failed to achieve their objectives. The bridgehead not only held, but also slightly expanded as Soviet counterattacks regained lost ground. German losses included dozens of tanks, among them a significant portion of the Tiger IIs committed, as well as thousands of personnel. Soviet losses were also considerable, particularly in armor and artillery. By the end of August, it was evident that the German capacity for large-scale counteroffensives in the sector was diminishing. The Sandomierz bridgehead had withstood its most serious challenge, and now stood as a permanent Soviet position west of the Vistula. This success meant that any future German defensive planning in Poland would have to account for a Soviet foothold capable of launching deep operations into the heart of the country. The outcome of the fighting in August effectively confirmed the bridgehead's role as a launch point for the eventual advance into Germany's eastern territories, bringing the strategic goal of the Lviv-Sandomierz offensive within reach. The conclusion of the Lviv-Sandomierz offensive in late August 1944 left the Soviet First Ukrainian Front in possession of both its operational objectives and a strategic position that would influence the remainder of the war on the Eastern Front. With Lviv liberated, the Brody pocket eliminated, and the Sandomier's bridgehead firmly secured, Soviet forces had opened the southern route toward central Poland and, ultimately, Berlin. The offensive, lasting from 13th July to 29th August, had pushed the front line hundreds of kilometers westward, destroyed significant portions of Army Group North Ukraine, and established a permanent Soviet presence on the western bank of the Vistula. The immediate aftermath for the German side was severe. The destruction of 8 divisions in the Brody pocket, coupled with heavy losses in the battles for Lviv and the bridgehead, left Army Group North Ukraine with depleted manpower and reduced armored strength. The failure to eliminate the Sandomier's bridgehead, despite committing elite formations and heavy tanks, underscored the declining operational capabilities of the Wehrmacht in the east. The loss of Lviv also severed critical communication and supply links to German forces in the Carpathians and further south, complicating coordination with Army Group South Ukraine, which itself was under heavy pressure. For the Soviet Union, the operation was both a military and political success. Militarily, it demonstrated the Red Army's ability to conduct large-scale, coordinated, multi-phase operations that combined deep encirclements with sustained pursuit and river-crossing operations. The offensive's success ensured that Soviet forces were positioned to launch subsequent operations in southern Poland and Slovakia without the need for prolonged regrouping. Politically, the liberation of western Ukraine and the advance into Polish territory reinforced Soviet influence in the region and contributed to post-war territorial arrangements. The humanitarian consequences were considerable. Combat operations had devastated large areas of western Ukraine, and cities such as Lviv suffered damage from artillery and street fighting, while rural areas along the front endured destruction of homes, infrastructure, and farmland. Civilian casualties, displacement, and shortages of food and medical supplies were widespread. The advancing Soviet forces also initiated political changes in liberated areas, including the re-establishment of Soviet administrative structures and the integration of local resources into the war effort. In terms of strategic impact, the Sandomier's bridgehead emerged as one of the most important Soviet footholds west of the Vistula. Over the following months, it was fortified and stocked with supplies in preparation for the Vistula-Oder offensive, launched in January 1945. Its location allowed Soviet forces to bypass heavily fortified German positions farther north and strike directly into the heart of German defenses. From the German perspective, the Lviv-Sandomier's offensive marked a decisive loss of initiative in the southern sector of the Eastern Front. The inability to hold key terrain or conduct successful large-scale counteroffensives meant that the Wehrmacht in this theater was now forced into a continuous defensive posture, reacting to Soviet advances rather than shaping the battlefield. The depletion of reserves in the attempt to contain the Sandomier's bridgehead also weakened German defenses in other sectors, contributing to the overall deterioration of the Eastern Front by the end of 1944. In historical retrospect, the operation's success lay not only in its territorial gains, but also in the way it set the conditions for the Red Army's final offensives into Central Europe. It was one of the key campaigns of the summer of 1944 that, together with Operation Bagration in the north, the Lviv-Sandomierz offensive opened the road to Berlin, both geographically and operationally, and demonstrated the capacity of the Soviet armed forces to sustain strategic offensives across multiple fronts until the war's end. In the late summer and early autumn of 1944, a pivotal Soviet military effort unfolded in the Carpathian Mountains, aiming to drive toward Uzhhorod. This region, occupying a critical juncture between Ukraine, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, had been shaped by shifting allegiances and border realignments in preceding years. The broader framework for this operation was the East Carpathian Strategic Offensive, conducted by the Soviet Fourth Ukrainian Front beginning in early September 1944. Its explicit objective was to seize key mountain passes, including Dukla, Gumena, and Uzhhorod, and to secure a route into the lowlands beyond the Carpathians. These directives stemmed from Stavka orders dated 28 and 30 July 1944, which tasked Soviet forces with seize and firmly hold the passes through the Carpathian Mountains along the Gumena, Uzhhorod, and Mukachevo axes, with the aim of subsequent entry into the Hungarian plain. At this stage of the war, the Red Army had already achieved substantial strategic advantages. The preceding Dnieper-Carpathian offensive, unfolding from late December 1943 through early May 1944, had pushed German forces out of most of right bank Ukraine and split the Wehrmacht's Army Group South into northern and southern elements. The northern part retreated into Galicia, while the southern portion was forced into Romania. This campaign cost the Soviets approximately 109,528 casualties, including 198 killed or missing, and inflicted around 250,156 combat casualties on the Germans. Further to the south, the Uman-Botoshani offensive, 5 March 17 in April 1944, added to the German collapse. Marshal Ivan Konev's Second Ukrainian Front advanced some 300 kilometers, expelled German forces from southwestern Ukraine, and entered into Romanian and Moldavian territory. Soviet casualties exceeded 121,000 in March and 64 to 354 in April, while German losses included roughly 300 tanks abandoned or captured near Uman. By late summer 1944, Stavka's attention had turned decisively to the Carpathian region. The Soviets needed to secure mountain passes to facilitate advances into Hungary and Slovakia and to threaten the German Southern Front. In preparation, the Fourth Ukrainian Front, already composed of units seasoned by mountain warfare, such as the 129th Guards Rifle Division, was transferred from Crimea to the Carpathian foothills. By early September, its 107th Rifle Corps, including the 129th, 167th, and 276th Rifle Divisions, began operations aimed at breaking through German defenses in passes like Dukla, moving toward Uzhhorod. Geopolitically, the stakes were high. Capture of Uzhhorod and the broader Transcarpathian region would enable encirclement of German forces in Transylvania and secure the Soviet Union's western flank. At the same time, Czechoslovak-Soviet agreements stipulated that liberated areas of sub-Carpathian Ruthenia would be handed over to provisional Czechoslovak administration once combat operations ended. Soviet intelligence estimated that German resistance would be entrenched but surmountable through coordinated infantry, armor, and artillery operations. Public sentiment within the USSR aligned with the broader momentum of liberation campaigns sweeping westward. This combination of prior strategic successes, layered objectives, and refined planning formed the geopolitical and military groundwork for the Soviet push toward Uzhhorod. The Soviet push toward Uzhhorod began in early September 1944, with coordinated movements across a broad front in the Eastern Carpathians. The Fourth Ukrainian Front, commanded by Army General Ivan Petrov, was tasked with advancing along the mountain approaches toward the Dukla Pass and beyond, aiming to break through Axis defensive lines and reach the Hungarian plain. The German defense was organized under Army Group Heinrici, part of Army Group North Ukraine, which included the 1st Panzer Army and elements of the Hungarian First Army. These forces had prepared fortified lines integrated with natural barriers, taking advantage of the steep ridges, narrow valleys, and forested slopes that defined the terrain. Defensive positions were reinforced with bunkers, trenches, and minefields, supported by artillery and mortars positioned to cover likely avenues of approach. The opening phase began with artillery preparation lasting several hours, designed to disrupt communication lines, destroy fortified positions, and weaken enemy morale before infantry and armor advanced. Soviet rifle divisions moved in coordinated waves, supported by tank brigades adapted for mountain warfare, although the steep gradients and narrow roads limited the use of heavy armor. Air support from the 8th Air Army was concentrated on striking German supply depots and troop concentrations, but low cloud cover and unpredictable weather often curtailed sorties. Initial Soviet gains were modest. In the first week, forces advanced only a few kilometers in some sectors, capturing outlying villages and minor ridges but encountering stubborn resistance. German and Hungarian troops executed delaying tactics, conducting counterattacks that aimed to recapture lost ground and inflict attritional losses. The terrain amplified the defenders' advantage. Narrow passes could be blocked with demolitions, while forested slopes allowed for concealed machine gun nests that were difficult to neutralize without costly frontal assaults. Soviet command sought to maintain pressure along multiple axes to prevent the defenders from concentrating their forces. The main thrust toward Dukla Pass was supported by secondary offensives on parallel routes, including pushes toward Lubkov Pass and along the valleys of the Uzh and Laborek rivers. Coordination between corps was complicated by the mountainous geography, with units often separated by ridges and relying on limited road networks for resupply and reinforcement. Logistical strains emerged early. Supply convoys faced constant harassment from enemy artillery and airstrikes, and the movement of ammunition and food required extensive use of horse-drawn transport in addition to trucks. Despite these challenges, Soviet forces succeeded in establishing several bridgeheads and forward positions close to key passes by mid-September. Casualties on both sides mounted. Soviet losses in the first 2 weeks numbered in the thousands, with some rifle divisions reduced by up to a quarter of their initial strength. German and Hungarian formations also suffered significant attrition, particularly in artillery and anti-tank assets, but remained capable of mounting organized defensive actions. The initial phase revealed the scale of the challenge ahead. The advance into the Carpathians was slower and costlier than Stavka had anticipated, and the defenders' skill in exploiting the terrain made clear that capturing Uzhhorod would require sustained effort, concentrated resources, and careful coordination between infantry, armor, artillery, and air power. Strategic planning for the continuation of the Soviet advance toward Uzhhorod evolved in response to the slow progress and heavy fighting of the first weeks. The original Stavka directive had envisioned a relatively rapid penetration through the Dukla and other key passes, followed by a descent into the valleys leading toward Uzhhorod and Mukachevo. Intelligence assessments had underestimated both the depth of German defensive preparations and the speed with which Army Group Heinrici could reinforce threatened sectors. By late September 1944, it became evident that the offensive would require a prolonged and attritional approach rather than the swift breakthrough initially envisioned. The strategic objectives remained consistent. For the Soviet Fourth Ukrainian Front, the primary aim was to secure Uzhhorod as a gateway into the Hungarian plain, thus enabling a link-up with Soviet forces advancing from the south through Transylvania. Secondary goals included disrupting German lines of communication between Slovakia and Hungary, forcing the withdrawal of Axis troops from central Slovakia, and opening a corridor for the Czechoslovak First Army Corps to advance into its homeland. The German and Hungarian defenders, aware of these objectives, sought to hold the mountain passes for as long as possible, buying time for the reorganization of defenses deeper in Slovakia and northern Hungary. Logistical considerations played a central role in planning for both sides. The Soviets had to establish and maintain supply lines through rugged, narrow mountain roads, many of which were unsuited to heavy traffic and vulnerable to enemy artillery. Engineering units worked continuously to repair bridges, clear mines, and widen paths for trucks and horse-drawn wagons. In some sectors, aerial supply drops were attempted to support forward units cut off by counterattacks or difficult terrain. Fuel consumption rates for vehicles operating in low gears on steep inclines proved higher than anticipated, further straining resources. The Germans, in turn, relied on an intricate system of pre-prepared depots, concealed ammunition stores, and the use of narrow-gauge rail lines on the Hungarian side of the passes to move reinforcements and supplies closer to the front. Doctrinally, the Soviets attempted to adapt their operational methods to mountain warfare conditions. This included assigning specialized mountain rifle brigades to spearhead assaults on high ground and integrating light artillery that could be dismantled and transported by pack animals. However, the need to coordinate with standard rifle divisions, tank units, and mechanized brigades often led to delays and friction. German doctrine emphasized defensive elasticity, holding key positions until under direct threat, then withdrawing to secondary lines while inflicting maximum casualties through ambushes and interlocking fields of fire. Hungarian units, many of which were familiar with Carpathian terrain, excelled at using small unit actions to disrupt Soviet advances, especially during night operations. Propaganda accompanied the military planning. Soviet communications emphasized the liberation of Czechoslovak and Carpatho-Ukrainian territory, highlighting cooperation with the Czechoslovak First Army Corps to bolster morale among troops and the local population. Leaflets in Ukrainian, Slovak, and Hungarian were distributed to encourage defections and undermine enemy resolve. On the German side, propaganda stressed the defense of the Carpathian fortress as a bulwark against Soviet penetration into Central Europe, portraying the battle as decisive for the fate of Hungary and Slovakia. By early October 1944, both commands recognized that the battle was shifting toward a test of endurance. The Soviets concentrated artillery assets to prepare for coordinated assaults on multiple passes, hoping to stretch the defenders beyond their capacity to respond. German and Hungarian forces continued to rotate frontline units, pulling battered formations back for refitting while deploying fresh reserves to critical points. The stage was set for the first major full-scale engagements that would decide control of the high passes and the road to Uzhhorod. The first large-scale engagements in the Soviet push toward Uzhhorod began in early October 1944, concentrated along the Dukla Pass sector and parallel approaches. Soviet forces committed to the main effort included the 38th Army under Colonel General Kirill Moskalenko, supported by the Czechoslovak First Army Corps, commanded by General Ludvík Svoboda. Against them stood elements of the German 1st Panzer Army, including the 1st Mountain Division, 97th Jaeger Division, and parts of the 357th Infantry Division, reinforced by the Hungarian 1st Mountain Brigade and other Hungarian infantry formations. These units had prepared their defenses with overlapping fields of fire, pre-registered artillery coordinates, and extensive use of natural rock outcroppings as fortified positions. The Soviet opening moves involved sustained artillery barrages intended to neutralize key defensive nodes and disrupt command posts. In the Dukla Pass sector alone, several hundred guns and mortars concentrated their fire on a narrow front, targeting known bunker complexes and suspected observation posts. Infantry assaults followed in waves, with Czechoslovak units often advancing alongside Soviet rifle divisions to seize ridgelines dominating the pass. However, progress was immediately hindered by well-concealed machine gun positions and minefields laid across the only viable approach routes. In the first week of heavy fighting, the Soviets captured a number of forward enemy positions, but paid a high cost in manpower. Some battalions reported losses exceeding 40% after attempting to storm fortified slopes under concentrated artillery and mortar fire. German and Hungarian defenders frequently counterattacked, using the cover of dense forests to infiltrate flanks and recapture lost trenches. These actions forced Soviet units to commit reserves earlier than planned, limiting their ability to exploit breakthroughs. Further south, advances along the Uzh River Valley met similar resistance. Narrow roads, steep banks, and the constant threat of landslides or destroyed bridges slowed the movement of supplies and artillery. In several instances, Soviet forward units became temporarily isolated, when German engineers demolished bridges behind retreating forces, compelling Soviet sappers to conduct emergency repairs under fire. Coordination with armored units was challenging. Tanks and self-propelled guns could not easily maneuver through the winding mountain paths, and those that did reach the front were often restricted to supporting infantry in direct fire roles against pillboxes and fortified buildings. The fighting in early October revealed that Axis forces were determined to defend every ridge and village. Villages such as Kapishova, Svidnik, and Nizhna Pisana became focal points for repeated assaults and counter-assaults, with control sometimes changing hands multiple times in a single day. The destruction of infrastructure was extensive. Many settlements were reduced to rubble. Wells were deliberately contaminated, and farmland was mined to slow advancing troops. Civilians who had not evacuated were caught in the crossfire, with casualties mounting despite efforts by both sides to move non-combatants away from the immediate front. Weather compounded the difficulties. Heavy autumn rains turned dirt roads into mud, reducing supply vehicle speeds to a crawl and sometimes immobilizing them entirely. Visibility in the fog-covered mountain passes was frequently reduced to a few dozen meters, limiting the effectiveness of artillery spotting and aerial reconnaissance. Aircraft from the Soviet 8th Air Army flew fewer sorties than planned due to the persistent low cloud ceiling, though they managed some successful strikes on German supply convoys moving along the Hungarian side of the border. By mid-October, the Soviets had made incremental progress toward key passes, but had not achieved a decisive breakthrough. The Axis defense lines, though battered, remained intact, forcing Soviet commanders to consider deeper flanking maneuvers and more concentrated attacks to break the deadlock. The battle was settling into a prolonged and costly contest for control of the Carpathian approaches, with both sides committing reinforcements to prevent collapse at critical points. The first engagements had proven that the route to Uzhhorod would be won only through sustained methodical pressure in the face of formidable resistance. As the battle for the Carpathian passes intensified in the second half of October 1944, the fighting entered a phase of escalation that drew in additional forces, resources, and political attention. Soviet Stavka, aware that the original timetable for capturing Uzhhorod had slipped considerably, ordered the 4th Ukrainian Front to concentrate its efforts on breaking the Dukla axis and advancing toward the Hungarian border before winter weather made large-scale operations in the mountains impossible. Reinforcements were brought forward, including fresh rifle divisions and artillery regiments from reserve formations, while existing units received replacements to offset the attrition suffered in the first weeks. On the Axis side, Army Group Heinrizi shifted additional German mountain and infantry battalions to the front, supported by Hungarian formations familiar with the terrain, in an effort to hold the high ground at all costs. The terrain continued to play a decisive role in the operational tempo. The steep ridges and deep valleys favored defensive tactics, allowing smaller Axis forces to delay larger Soviet units by blocking narrow passes or holding isolated hilltops. German artillery observers stationed on high vantage points could direct accurate fire onto Soviet assembly areas and approach routes, inflicting heavy casualties before assaults could even begin. The Soviets responded by increasing the use of night attacks, aiming to close the distance to enemy positions under cover of darkness, though such operations were complicated by the difficulty of navigation in unfamiliar terrain. The reinforcement phase also saw a marked increase in the scale of artillery duels. Soviet heavy guns, including 152 mm howitzers, were positioned on ridges within range of German strongpoints, while the Axis defenders relied on well-camouflaged field pieces and mortars. Ammunition expenditure rose sharply. Some Soviet artillery units fired hundreds of shells per day during preparatory bombardments. Supply lines, already strained, were pushed to their limits, with mule trains, horse-drawn wagons, and teams of soldiers carrying crates of ammunition up narrow, muddy trails to the gun positions. Weather conditions further complicated operations. Heavy rains in late October caused rivers and streams to swell, washing out temporary bridges and delaying the movement of artillery and supply convoys. Mudslides blocked some mountain roads entirely, forcing engineering units to cut new tracks along precarious slopes. The constant dampness also led to an increase in illness among soldiers, with cases of trench foot, pneumonia, and other exposure-related ailments reported in both Soviet and Axis ranks. Medical units struggled to evacuate the wounded from forward positions due to the lack of reliable vehicle access, often relying on stretcher teams and pack animals. The political dimension of the battle grew as the Soviet advance slowed. Moscow pressed for faster results to coordinate with the ongoing operations in Hungary and to fulfill commitments to the Czechoslovak government in exile regarding the liberation of Slovak and Carpatho-Ukrainian territory. In Berlin and Budapest, the High Command emphasized the importance of holding the Carpathian Line to protect the Hungarian plain and maintain a defensive buffer against the advancing Red Army. German propaganda highlighted the mountain front as a symbol of resistance, while Hungarian media portrayed the defense as vital for the survival of the nation. Civilian impact during this period was severe. Villages caught in the contested zones faced repeated shelling, requisitioning of food and livestock, and forced labor to repair roads or fortifications. Displaced persons moved through the valleys in search of safety, often under fire. Some local inhabitants assisted Soviet troops as guides or by providing intelligence on enemy positions, while others, fearing reprisals, attempted to remain neutral or aided Axis forces in the hope of preserving their homes. By the end of October, the scale of casualties reflected the intensifying struggle. Soviet divisions often reported several hundred losses in a single day of heavy fighting, while German and Hungarian units experienced similar rates when defending positions under concentrated bombardment. Yet, despite these losses, the front lines shifted only gradually, with both sides preparing for even greater commitments of men and material as the campaign reached its peak. The stage was set for some of the most intense and sustained battles of the Carpathian Offensive. The peak of the Carpathian campaign toward Uzhhorod came in late October and early November 1944, when Soviet forces launched their most concentrated assaults along the Dukla axis and supporting approaches. The 38th Army, working in close coordination with the Czechoslovak First Army Corps, committed multiple rifle divisions to simultaneous attacks on the dominant heights and fortified villages guarding the main road to the pass. These actions were supported by massed artillery and mortar fire, as well as limited air support from the 8th Air Army during brief periods of clear weather. Soviet commanders aimed to overwhelm the Axis defense through sheer density of fire and coordinated infantry pressure, exploiting any breach before German and Hungarian reserves could react. One of the central engagements during this phase occurred around the village of Kapishova, where German forces had entrenched themselves in a defensive system anchored by concrete bunkers, interlinked trenches, and concealed firing positions on the slopes above the main road. The Soviet 305th Rifle Division, supported by Czechoslovak infantry, attacked repeatedly over several days. Artillery barrages leveled much of the village, but the defenders held on through counterattacks and accurate mortar fire. Only after sustained fighting that cost both sides hundreds of casualties was the position finally abandoned by German troops, who withdrew to secondary lines deeper in the pass. Elsewhere, battles for high ground such as Hill 534 and Hill 701 became prolonged contests in their own right. Control of these heights was critical for artillery observation and for dominating the surrounding valleys. Soviet units often assaulted these positions multiple times in a single week, with gains measured in tens of meters. German mountain troops, trained for such terrain, counterattacked swiftly to retake lost ground, forcing Soviet commanders to commit reserves to hold newly captured objectives. The constant back and forth over these ridges consumed significant manpower and ammunition without producing a decisive breakthrough. The intensity of operations during this period strained both armies to their limits. Soviet artillery units reported ammunition shortages despite the heavy logistical effort to resupply them. Axis forces, meanwhile, were increasingly dependent on supplies brought in from the Hungarian plain via vulnerable mountain roads, which were targeted by Soviet air attacks whenever weather permitted. Fuel shortages began to limit German and Hungarian motorized movements, forcing greater reliance on horse-drawn transport and slowing the ability to reinforce threatened sectors. Civilian suffering reached its height during this phase of the campaign. Villages near the front were often completely destroyed by bombardment, and surviving residents were evacuated, sometimes forcibly, by either side to clear the area for military use. Local infrastructure, including rail lines and bridges, was systematically demolished to deny the enemy rapid movement. The destruction extended beyond immediate combat zones as both Soviet and Axis units targeted transportation hubs and depots deeper in enemy-controlled territory to disrupt the flow of reinforcements. Weather again played a decisive role. Cold rains gave way to early snowfalls in the higher elevations, further complicating the movement of vehicles and artillery. Ice formed on steep mountain tracks, making them hazardous for both wheeled and pack transport. Units that had already endured weeks of fighting now faced exposure to freezing temperatures with inadequate shelter in many forward positions. Frostbite cases began to appear alongside combat injuries, adding to the burden on already overstretched medical services. By early November, the Soviet Fourth Ukrainian Front had advanced into the outer defenses of Uzhhorod's approaches, but had yet to achieve full operational penetration through all major passes. The Axis defenders, though increasingly worn down, continued to contest every kilometer. The fighting had reached a level of intensity where both sides were locked in a struggle of attrition, each hoping that the other would reach the limits of endurance first. The next phase of the battle would see adaptations in tactics, as each side sought to break the deadlock before the onset of deep winter. As November 1944 progressed, both Soviet and Axis forces adjusted their tactics in an effort to sustain operations under deteriorating conditions. For the Soviets, the need to maintain offensive momentum before the onset of full winter was paramount. Commanders of the Fourth Ukrainian Front restructured their assault patterns, favoring shorter, concentrated attacks aimed at seizing one or two key objectives at a time, rather than attempting broad advances along the entire front. This allowed artillery and air support to be focused more effectively, and reduced the strain on logistics, which had become increasingly difficult as snow and ice began to cover the mountain roads. One adaptation was the expanded use of specialized mountain rifle units, which were more mobile in the rugged terrain and less dependent on heavy vehicles. These formations operated in smaller groups, advancing along ridges or through forested slopes to outflank enemy positions. They were supported by light mortars and machine guns that could be disassembled and carried by pack animals. In certain sectors, Soviet units coordinated with Czechoslovak troops familiar with local geography, using their knowledge to identify paths and defiles that bypassed heavily defended routes. The Axis forces likewise adapted, making use of their defensive advantage in the high ground. German and Hungarian commanders increasingly relied on well-planned withdrawal and counterattack tactics, pulling back from positions under heavy pressure and then striking at overextended Soviet units. In several instances, small German detachments managed to cut Soviet supply lines or capture isolated forward positions by exploiting gaps created during the reorganization of assault formations. These actions slowed the Soviet advance and forced the Fourth Ukrainian Front to keep significant reserves in readiness to guard against infiltration. The logistical challenge grew more acute on both sides. Soviet supply convoys moved slowly through the snow-covered passes, with horse-drawn sledges supplementing truck transport. Ammunition shortages remained a persistent issue, particularly for artillery units. German and Hungarian forces faced their own difficulties as Soviet artillery and aircraft targeted the narrow mountain roads leading from the Hungarian plain, destroying bridges and blocking routes with landslides triggered by shelling. Fuel shortages were increasingly severe for the defenders, limiting their ability to move reserves quickly to threatened points. In the rear areas, partisan activity also influenced the conduct of the campaign. Soviet-aligned resistance groups in the Carpathians, though limited in size, conducted reconnaissance, sabotaged communications, and provided guides for advancing units. The Germans responded with sweeps through suspected partisan zones, diverting manpower from the front, but ensuring that their supply routes remained usable. The complex terrain made these anti-partisan operations slow and manpower-intensive. The psychological toll of the campaign became evident during this stage. Units on both sides had endured continuous combat for weeks, in harsh mountain conditions, with limited rest and exposure to cold and damp. Morale fluctuated depending on local successes or failures. Soviet propaganda emphasized the liberation of Carpatho Ukraine and the approach toward Hungary, while Axis messaging stressed the importance of defending Central Europe from Soviet occupation. In some Hungarian units, the prolonged fighting in difficult terrain led to growing war weariness, particularly among reservists. By the third week of November, Soviet forces had secured several additional ridgelines and approaches to Uzhhorod, placing them within striking distance of the city's outer defenses. However, the main Axis defensive belt in the region remained intact, anchored on fortified positions that had been prepared months in advance. Both sides understood that any decisive breakthrough at this stage would require concentrated force and precise timing. For the Soviets, this meant preparing for one final push before winter halted large-scale operations. For the Germans and Hungarians, it meant holding until the season's weather gave them a natural advantage in slowing the offensive. The campaign was entering a phase where endurance, adaptation, and control of the few passable routes would determine its outcome. The turning point of the Soviet push toward Uzhhorod came in the final days of November 1944, when the Fourth Ukrainian Front concentrated its strength for a coordinated assault along the main Uzh Valley axis. Intelligence indicated that the German 1st Mountain Division and elements of the Hungarian First Army had thinned their lines in certain sectors to reinforce positions farther west, creating an opportunity to exploit reduced defensive density. Stavka authorized the redeployment of additional artillery regiments and a concentrated grouping of rifle divisions to press the attack before winter conditions made further progress impossible. The offensive began with a massive artillery preparation on 26 November. Over several hours, Soviet guns and mortars pounded identified strongpoints, supply dumps, and suspected command posts. The bombardment was accompanied by targeted airstrikes from the 8th Air Army, which, taking advantage of a rare break in the weather, hit transport nodes on the Hungarian side of the border to disrupt reinforcements. Soviet infantry advanced immediately after the barrage, supported by self-propelled guns positioned on roads and clearings where the terrain allowed. One of the key engagements occurred near the village of Solomonovo, east of Uzhhorod. Here, the Soviet 320th Rifle Division broke through the first line of German defenses, capturing a series of interconnected trenches and bunkers after close-quarter fighting. The defenders responded with counterattacks, deploying small groups of mountain troops to exploit gaps in Soviet formations. However, Soviet commanders committed fresh battalions to stabilize the line and continue the advance. By nightfall, the attackers had secured several kilometers of the Uzh Valley Road, bringing them significantly closer to the city. In parallel, Soviet units in the southern sector advanced toward Mukachevo, aiming to outflank Uzhhorod from the south and cut Axis withdrawal routes. This movement forced the Germans and Hungarians to divert reserves from the main defensive belt around Uzhhorod, weakening their capacity to hold the entire front. The Axis command recognized the risk of encirclement, but faced difficulties in executing a coordinated withdrawal due to damaged infrastructure, destroyed bridges, and constant harassment from Soviet artillery. The human cost of the turning point battles was high. Soviet casualty reports for the last week of November numbered in the thousands, with individual rifle regiments suffering over 200 killed and wounded in single-day assaults. Axis losses were similarly severe, compounded by the capture of prisoners when Soviet breakthroughs isolated forward positions. Medical facilities on both sides were overwhelmed, and the evacuation of wounded under snow and freezing rain slowed further due to impassable mountain tracks. The changing tactical situation was reinforced by the weather itself. Snow now covered most of the high passes, restricting mobility and making it nearly impossible to conduct large-scale counteroffensives. Soviet troops, operating in better supplied sectors, were able to rotate front-line units and deliver concentrated blows at selected points. German and Hungarian forces, however, had to stretch their manpower thin over an extended front, unable to respond with the same intensity to each Soviet attack. By the end of November, the Soviet Fourth Ukrainian Front had achieved a partial breakthrough into the outer defensive zone of Uzhhorod. The Axis position was becoming untenable, with supply lines threatened and flanks under pressure. While the defenders still held key strongpoints, their capacity to launch major counterattacks was diminishing rapidly. The strategic momentum had shifted decisively toward the Soviets, setting the stage for the final phase of the operation that would determine control of the city and the surrounding region. Combat operations in early December 1944 marked the beginning of the final stage of the Soviet drive on Uzhhorod. Following the partial breakthrough in late November, the Fourth Ukrainian Front shifted its focus to systematically dismantling the remaining Axis defensive network around the city. The advance proceeded along two main axes, the Uzh Valley from the east and the lowland approach from the southeast via Mukachevo. Coordination between these thrusts aimed to encircle Uzhhorod and cut all remaining lines of retreat into Slovakia and Hungary. The Soviet 320th and 351st Rifle Divisions advanced along the valley floor, clearing villages and fortified positions in sequence. Each position taken was immediately consolidated to guard against counterattack. German and Hungarian defenders, now heavily outnumbered and low on ammunition, relied on delay-in tactics, blowing bridges, mining crossroads, and using mobile artillery to disrupt Soviet concentrations before withdrawing. Despite these efforts, the attackers maintained steady pressure, rotating battalions to keep fresh troops in the assault. To the south, Soviet units pushing from Mukachevo faced determined resistance from elements of the Hungarian First Army, reinforced by remnants of German infantry divisions pulled from other sectors. Here, the fighting often took place in open lowland terrain, where the defenders could deploy anti-tank guns effectively. Soviet armor support was stronger on this axis than in the mountains, allowing for more rapid advances when enemy lines were breached. Coordinated infantry armor assaults enabled the capture of several key road junctions, gradually tightening the encirclement. Civilian areas bore the brunt of the closing battles. Villages on the approaches to Uzhhorod were subjected to heavy shelling as both sides sought to deny their use as defensive strongpoints. Many residents had already fled earlier in the campaign, but those remaining endured bombardment, shortages of food, and the destruction of homes and infrastructure. Soviet field kitchens and medical detachments attempted to provide limited aid to civilians in newly captured areas, though the priority remained on sustaining the combat units. Axis defensive cohesion began to erode under the combined strain of combat losses, logistical collapse, and worsening weather. Snowfall increased in frequency and depth, making vehicle movement difficult and further slowing the transport of supplies from the Hungarian plain. German and Hungarian commanders recognized that holding Uzhhorod was becoming untenable but sought to delay Soviet capture as long as possible to facilitate an orderly withdrawal of remaining forces toward the west. Soviet artillery played a decisive role in this phase. Batteries were moved forward to newly secured high ground, allowing for more accurate shelling of Uzhhorod's outer defenses and supply routes. The constant bombardment reduced the ability of the defenders to maneuver and forced them into static positions that were increasingly vulnerable to encirclement. Soviet reconnaissance patrols identified weak points and gaps in the defensive line, directing concentrated infantry attacks to exploit them. By mid-December, Soviet spearheads from both the Uzh Valley and Mukachevo directions were within a few kilometers of the city limits. Axis resistance had been reduced to isolated pockets, each fighting independently as communications broke down. The prospect of a full encirclement was imminent, and German and Hungarian units prepared for either withdrawal under cover of darkness or last-ditch defense within the urban perimeter. The battle for Uzhhorod was entering its decisive moment, with both sides aware that the coming days would determine control of the city and the conclusion of the Carpathian campaign. The final assault on Uzhhorod unfolded in the closing days of December 1944, as the Fourth Ukrainian Front executed a coordinated offensive from the east, southeast, and north to eliminate the remaining Axis presence in the city and its surroundings. Soviet forces advancing along the Uzh Valley moved into the outer suburbs under cover of concentrated artillery fire, which targeted known defensive positions, intersections, and suspected command centers. Simultaneously, the formations approaching from Mukachevo closed the southern approaches, cutting the last viable withdrawal route toward Hungary. The operation's objective was to secure Uzhhorod rapidly to prevent the defenders from establishing a prolonged urban defense. The German and Hungarian forces in the city were reduced to a composite garrison made up of depleted infantry battalions, local security units, and small armored detachments. Their positions included fortified buildings, barricaded streets, and pre-sighted machine gun nests covering main thoroughfares. Despite shortages of ammunition and supplies, these units fought to delay the Soviet entry long enough to allow portions of their forces to retreat westward. Street fighting began almost immediately upon the Soviet vanguard entering the built-up areas, with small unit engagements taking place in courtyards, warehouses, and railway yards. Soviet tactics emphasized bypassing strongpoints when possible to avoid unnecessary delays. Assault groups, supported by engineers, cleared barricades and disarmed mines, while rifle companies secured key infrastructure such as the railway station, river bridges, and road junctions. In several cases, defenders attempted to demolish bridges to slow the advance, but Soviet engineering detachments managed to secure and repair them quickly, ensuring the uninterrupted movement of reinforcements and supplies into the city. Fighting within Uzhhorod lasted for several days, marked by intense exchanges in the industrial districts and around the central administrative buildings. The defenders launched multiple counterattacks, often at night, to disrupt Soviet consolidation of captured areas. However, the attrition of previous weeks, combined with the lack of heavy weaponry, meant these efforts could not significantly alter the course of the battle. By 27 to 28 December, Soviet units had secured most of the city, forcing the remaining Axis troops to retreat toward the Slovak border under cover of darkness and worsening winter weather. The capture of Uzhhorod marked the effective conclusion of the Soviet Carpathian offensive in this sector. The city's fall opened the way into eastern Slovakia and provided a secure base for subsequent operations aimed at clearing the remaining German forces from the region. The immediate aftermath saw the Soviets consolidating control, establishing supply depots, and repairing key transport links to support ongoing campaigns in Central Europe. The Czechoslovak First Army Corps, which had fought alongside the Soviets, began preparations for operations deeper into Slovak territory, fulfilling part of the political commitments made earlier in the year. For the German and Hungarian forces, the loss of Uzhhorod represented both a tactical defeat and a strategic setback. It deprived them of a critical defensive anchor in the Carpathians and exposed their positions in Slovakia and northern Hungary to Soviet advances. Withdrawal from the city was conducted in haste, with many units abandoning heavy equipment and supplies that could not be evacuated over the snow-covered passes. In military terms, the battle demonstrated the challenges of sustained offensive operations in mountainous and winter conditions, as well as the limitations of static defenses once supply lines were compromised. Soviet success was achieved through a combination of persistence, adaptation to terrain, and the gradual attrition of enemy forces. In political terms, the operation strengthened Soviet influence in post-war Czechoslovakia and cemented control over Transcarpathian Ukraine. The liberation of Uzhhorod thus stood as both a military milestone and a precursor to the final offensives that would carry the Red Army into the heart of Central Europe in 1945.
In June 1941, as the Wehrmacht launched Operation Barbarossa, one of the largest clashes of armored forces in history erupted in western Ukraine, near the towns of Brody and Dubno. Often overlooked compared to later battles such as Kursk, this confrontation set the tone for the armored struggles that would dominate the Eastern Front. Its roots lay in the geopolitical and military developments of the years preceding the German invasion. The geopolitical background of the Brody-Dubno battle was shaped by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939, which divided Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. Following the pact, the Soviet Union annexed eastern Poland, the Baltic states, and Bessarabia. This expansion pushed the Soviet western border hundreds of kilometers closer to the Reich. When Hitler decided to abrogate the pact and launch, from the German perspective, Ukraine was of enormous strategic value. It offered agricultural resources, industrial centers, and vital transportation corridors. The southern axis of Barbarossa, commanded by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's Army Group South, was tasked with advancing into Ukraine, seizing Kiev, and pushing toward the Dnieper and beyond. Within this framework, General Ewald von Kleist's 1st Panzer Group formed the spearhead. Comprising 5 panzer divisions with around 600 operational tanks, supported by motorized infantry and Luftwaffe air cover, Kleist's force represented one of the most powerful armored concentrations of the invasion. The Soviet Union, anticipating the possibility of war, but uncertain about its timing, had deployed enormous forces along its new western borders. The Southwestern Front under General Mikhail Kirponos was responsible for defending Ukraine. Its 5th and 6th armies held the frontier positions, while its armored strength rested in 5 mechanized corps. These corps included the 8th, 9th, 15th, 19th, and 22nd Mechanized Corps, totaling around 4,000 tanks on paper. Among them were modern designs such as the T-34 medium tank and KV-1 heavy tank, superior in armor and firepower to most German machines. However, the majority of Soviet tanks were older models, such as the T-26 and BT series, lightly armored and often in poor mechanical condition. Military preparedness on both sides was uneven. The Germans enjoyed the advantage of surprise, well-coordinated command structures, and experience from campaigns in Poland, France, and the Balkans. Their operational doctrine emphasized speed, concentration, and deep penetration to disrupt enemy rear areas. Soviet mechanized corps, by contrast, were still being restructured in 1941. Many corps were under strength, lacking spare parts, trained crews, and sufficient fuel or ammunition stockpiles. Communications were fragile, with radios in short supply. The Soviet leadership, aware of German troop concentrations, but bound by Stalin's directive to avoid provocations, hesitated to take preemptive measures. The public sentiment in both nations reflected the wider geopolitical struggle. In Germany, propaganda emphasized the campaign as a crusade against Bolshevism and portrayed the Wehrmacht as invincible after victories in Western Europe. In the Soviet Union, the population was caught between official denials of imminent conflict and the shock of sudden invasion. When German armored spearheads crossed the frontier on 22 June 1941, the Red Army was ordered to mount immediate counteroffensives, setting the stage for the Brody-Dubno battle. Thus, the conditions for one of the largest tank battles of the Army Group South sought to deliver rapid blows that would collapse Soviet resistance in Ukraine, while Kirponos's southwestern front prepared to throw its mechanized corps into counterattacks to halt the German advance. The confrontation that followed would last nearly a week, involve thousands of tanks, and result in enormous casualties, offering a brutal preview of the armored clashes that would later define the Eastern Front. On 22 June 1941, Army Group South launched its offensive into Ukraine as part of the wider Operation Barbarossa. At dawn, German artillery and Luftwaffe aircraft struck Soviet airfields, command posts, and supply depots. Within hours, the 1st Panzer Group under General Ewald von Kleist crossed the border, spearheading the drive eastward. Panzer divisions pushed rapidly through frontier defenses, supported by motorized infantry and close air support. In the first 2 days, the Germans advanced up to 60 kilometers, seizing key river crossings and threatening to envelop Soviet formations positioned along the frontier. The Soviet Southwestern Front, commanded by General Mikhail Kirponos, faced immense pressure. Its 5th and 6th Armies, deployed along the border, suffered heavy bombardments and the destruction of hundreds of aircraft on the ground. Despite this, Stavka issued immediate orders for counterattacks. Stalin's directive to halt the invaders at the frontier left little room for strategic withdrawal. Mechanized corps stationed behind the front line were instructed to concentrate against the advancing German spearheads, aiming to blunt the momentum of Kleist's Panzer Group before it could reach deeper into Ukraine. Key Soviet commanders included General Dmitry Ryabyshev of the 8th Mechanized Corps, General Konstantin Rokossovsky of the 9th Mechanized Corps, General Mikhail Muzichenko leading the 6th Army, and General Nikolai Feklenko of the 19th Mechanized Corps. Collectively, their units were ordered to converge in the area between Brody and Dubno, where the German panzer columns were advancing. In total, 5 mechanized corps with more than 2,500 operational tanks were committed to the counteroffensive. However, the rapid pace of the German advance, poor communications, and logistical breakdowns meant that Soviet units arrived piecemeal rather than in coordinated strength. The Germans relied on the 11th and 16th Panzer Divisions, supported by the 13th and 25th Motorized Infantry Divisions, to push toward Brody. Their goal was to break open the Soviet front, exploit the gap, and link with infantry divisions advancing from the west. The Luftwaffe played a critical role, maintaining air superiority and targeting Soviet tank columns moving to the front. Soviet formations, often forced to march by day without air cover, suffered heavy losses before even reaching the battlefield. Initial Soviet counterattacks began on 23 June, when elements of the 8th and 15th Mechanized Corps struck at German spearheads near Brody. Despite fielding modern T-34 and KV-1 tanks, these assaults lacked coordination and support. Many units attacked without adequate reconnaissance, running into ambushes or minefields. German anti-tank guns and tactical use of 80mm flak weapons proved highly effective against even the heaviest Soviet armor. Nevertheless, isolated Soviet formations inflicted notable losses, demonstrating the resilience and potential of their new tank designs. Over the next several days, the battle spread across a wide front, from Brody to Dubno and Lutsk. Soviet commanders attempted to encircle German divisions by launching converging attacks from multiple mechanized corps. The 9th Mechanized Corps moved southward, the 19th pushed westward, and the 8th struck head-on. In theory, this maneuver could have enveloped Kleist's panzer group. In practice, poor coordination, delays, and fuel shortages undermined the effort. Soviet units often fought alone, their attacks dissipating against German strongpoints. By 26 June, the confrontation had escalated into one of the largest armored clashes in history up to that point. Thousands of tanks were engaged across the fields, forests, and villages of western Ukraine. German divisions sought to maintain their momentum toward Kiev, while Soviet forces tried desperately to block or delay them. The opening phase of the battle revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of each side: German operational cohesion and combined arms tactics versus Soviet numerical superiority, but fragmented command. The contest was far from decided, and both sides braced for the intense clashes that would follow. The strategic goals and planning behind the Battle of Brody-Dubno reflected the larger framework of Operation Barbarossa and the contrasting doctrines of the Wehrmacht and the Red Army. From the German perspective, the invasion of the Soviet Union was designed as a rapid campaign of annihilation. Army Group South, under Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, had the mission of advancing through Ukraine, capturing Kiev, and crossing the Dnieper River to secure the industrial and agricultural resources of the region. Within this plan, General Ewald von Kleist's 1st Panzer Group was the decisive arm. Its 5 panzer divisions, 9th, 11th, 13th, 14th, and 16th, supported by motorized infantry and Luftwaffe formations, were to break through the frontier defenses and thrust deep into Soviet territory, encircling enemy armies and cutting their retreat routes. Kleist's operational objective during the last week of June 1941 was to capture Lutsk, Dubno, and Brody, and to drive further east toward Rovno and Zhytomyr. By achieving this, the 1st Panzer Group would split the Soviet 5th and 6th Armies, disrupt the Southwestern Front's defenses, and open the way to Kiev. German planning emphasized speed, encirclement, and coordination between armor, infantry, and air power. Supplies were calculated for a rapid advance, with fuel and ammunition depots moved forward along captured railways. The Luftwaffe's task was to maintain air superiority, interdict Soviet movements, and provide close support for the panzers. The Soviet strategic goals, Stalin and the Stavka, unwilling to concede territory so soon after the invasion, ordered immediate counterattacks to destroy the German spearheads before they could advance further into Ukraine. The Southwestern Front under General Mikhail Kirponos was instructed to commit its mechanized corps in a coordinated blow against Kleist's advancing panzer divisions. The idea was to concentrate overwhelming armored strength in the Brody-Dubno sector, deliver flank attacks on the German columns, and encircle or destroy them before they reached the Dnieper. On paper, the Soviet Mechanized Corps offered formidable power. The 8th Mechanized Corps under General Dmitry Ryabyshev had nearly 900 tanks, including over 100 modern T-34s and KV-1s. The 9th Mechanized Corps under Konstantin Rokossovsky fielded about 300 tanks, while the 15th Mechanized Corps under General Ignaty Karpatso had 700. The 19th Mechanized Corps brought another 450, and the 22nd added around 250. Altogether, more than 2,500 operational tanks were assigned to the counteroffensive. In theory, this dwarfed the 600 tanks of Kleist's 1st Panzer Group. However, in practice, Soviet planning suffered from significant flaws. Logistics represented the most serious weakness. Many Soviet tanks, particularly the BT-7s and T-26s that made up the majority, were mechanically unreliable and had already suffered breakdowns during the marches to the front. Spare parts were scarce, fuel supplies were insufficient, and maintenance units were overwhelmed. Communications also hampered coordination. Most Soviet tanks lacked radios, forcing commanders to rely on flags or couriers in battle. The newly expanded mechanized corps were still unfamiliar with large-scale operations. Many of their officers had been promoted hastily, and training was incomplete. German Kleist's orders emphasized maintaining offensive momentum and exploiting the initial shock of the invasion. He did not expect to face thousands of tanks converging on his spearheads. German intelligence reports before Barbarossa had identified Soviet mechanized forces, but underestimated both their numbers and the quality of newer models. The appearance of T-34s and KV-1s came as an unpleasant surprise to German crews, though superior German tactics and anti-tank weapons mitigated this threat. Despite the weaknesses of Soviet logistics, the Stavka believed that numerical superiority could compensate. Stalin's insistence on counteroffensives at the frontier reflected his political calculation that allowing the Wehrmacht deep into Soviet territory would undermine morale and give Germany access to critical resources. Orders issued between 23 and 25 June directed the Southwestern Front to concentrate its mechanized corps in a pincer against Kleist's 1st Panzer Group. The 8th and 15th Mechanized Corps would strike from the south near Brody, while the 9th and 19th would attack from the north near Dubno, aiming to envelop German panzer divisions advancing toward Rovno. The execution of these plans, however, revealed the disparity between theoretical goals and practical realities. Soviet forces had to march up to 500 kilometers in some cases to reach the battlefield. Many tanks broke down en route. Fuel convoys were attacked by the Luftwaffe, and units arrived on the battlefield exhausted and under strength. Coordination between corps was poor, with attacks often launched at different times and against different objectives. Instead of a concentrated strike, the Soviets delivered a series of fragmented assaults that Kleist's panzers were able to repel in detail. German logistics, by contrast, were better prepared for rapid operations. Supply convoys moved along captured roads, Luftwaffe units kept pressure on Soviet transport columns, and the shorter distances of advance allowed German panzer divisions to remain supplied. Even so, the fast tempo strained their resources, with fuel shortages threatening to halt advances if supply lines were disrupted. Kleist relied heavily on captured Soviet fuel and ammunition to sustain his divisions. The propaganda dimension also shaped perceptions. German communiques emphasized the destruction of Soviet mechanized forces and portrayed the battle as confirmation of German superiority. Soviet announcements initially downplayed setbacks, highlighting instead the heavy resistance being offered. Within the Red Army, commanders faced enormous pressure to deliver results regardless of losses, contributing to repeated assaults against fortified German positions even when the Germans sought rapid encirclement and advance to Kiev, while the Soviets aimed to halt them with a concentrated armored counteroffensive. In theory, Soviet numerical superiority could have inflicted a devastating blow on the 1st Panzer Group. In practice, logistical shortcomings, fragmented planning, and German operational cohesion would shape the course of the battle. The days ahead would see thousands of tanks clash across western Ukraine, producing a contest of unprecedented scale whose lessons would echo in the later armored battles of the war. The clash at Brody-Dubno began in earnest between 24 and 27 June 1941, when Soviet mechanized corps, moving under orders from the Southwestern Front, began their counteroffensive against Kleist's 1st Panzer Group. What unfolded was a chaotic yet colossal confrontation across hundreds of square kilometers in western Ukraine, stretching from Lutsk to Brody-Dubno and Rovno. It involved nearly 3,000 Soviet tanks of various models and approximately 600 German tanks, supported by motorized infantry, artillery, and the Luftwaffe. It was the largest tank battle in history up to that point, eclipsed only later by engagements such as Kursk. The first engagements occurred on 24 June near Lutsk, where the 9th Mechanized Corps under Konstantin Rokossovsky attempted to strike the northern flank of the German advance. Rokossovsky's corps, though relatively small with about 300 tanks, included some of the best-trained Soviet crews and a number of modern T-34 and KV-1 tanks. His forces achieved local successes, disrupting German infantry and destroying lighter German Panzer II and Panzer 35T models. However, Rokossovsky lacked support on his flanks, and by the end of the day, his units had to withdraw to avoid encirclement, having lost dozens of tanks in the process. Meanwhile, to the south, the 8th Mechanized Corps under Dmitry Ryabyshev launched its assault from the Brody sector. With nearly 900 tanks, it was one of the strongest mechanized corps in the Red Army. Ryabyshev's units drove directly into the German 11th Panzer Division, and for the first time in the campaign, German panzer crews encountered the formidable T-34 and KV-1 in significant numbers. German anti-tank guns, which were effective against lighter Soviet machines, struggled to penetrate the armor of the newer models. Accounts describe KV-1s withstanding dozens of hits before being disabled, forcing German units to employ 88mm flak guns in direct fire roles. Despite these challenges, German tactical discipline, superior radio communications, and coordinated air support prevented a breakthrough. The Soviet offensive gained ground but failed to achieve decisive penetration. The 15th Mechanized Corps under Ignatiy Karpezo joined the fighting around Brody on 25 June. Its 700 tanks included many older T-26 and BT series vehicles, vulnerable to German firepower. Poor coordination between the 8th and 15th Corps meant that their attacks did not converge at the same time, giving Kleist's divisions the opportunity to defeat each assault separately. Luftwaffe dive bombers, particularly the Ju-87 Stukas, inflicted devastating losses on Soviet tank columns, which often had to move in daylight due to lack of concealment. Entire battalions were reduced to wrecks before they reached the front. The 19th Mechanized Corps under General Feklenko entered the battle near Dubno, with around 450 tanks. Its attack was intended to strike at the German 16th Panzer Division, but logistical difficulties slowed its advance. Fuel shortages forced many tanks to be abandoned en route. Those that did arrive engaged in fierce battles with German spearheads, at times halting their progress, but again lacking coordination with neighboring Soviet corps. By 26 June, the fighting had spread across a wide arc. At Dubno, Brody, and Lutsk, Soviet tanks clashed head-on with German panzers, sometimes in engagements involving hundreds of vehicles. In one encounter near Dubno, Soviet crews attempted mass charges of T-34s against German positions, briefly overwhelming the defenders before being cut down by concentrated artillery and airstrikes. German panzer divisions, though outnumbered, used maneuver and communication to outflank Soviet formations, isolating and destroying them in smaller engagements. The Luftwaffe played a decisive role throughout these opening engagements. With control of the air, German aircraft attacked Soviet tank concentrations, supply columns, and rear areas. Soviet Mechanized Corps, already struggling with fuel shortages and mechanical failures, suffered further losses when fuel trucks were destroyed and roads blocked by wreckage. This prevented effective resupply and left many Soviet tanks immobilized even before reaching the battlefield. Civilians in the region witnessed devastation as battles raged through towns and villages. Columns of burning tanks and strafing aircraft turned fields into graveyards of machines. Many civilians fled, while others were caught between advancing and retreating armies, enduring bombardment and destruction of property. Local infrastructure, including bridges and railways, was destroyed in the fighting, further complicating Soviet logistical efforts. Despite enormous Soviet commitment, the opening clashes highlighted systemic weaknesses. Soviet attacks were fragmented. Communications between corps and higher headquarters were frequently severed, leaving commanders with little information about neighboring units. German divisions, smaller in numbers but cohesive in execution, could exploit these gaps. By the end of 27 June, the battle remained unresolved, but the pattern was clear. Soviet mechanized corps were launching massive assaults, often with bravery and numerical strength, but the lack of coordination, logistical collapse, and German tactical superiority prevented decisive success. The Wehrmacht had been checked temporarily, but it retained its momentum. The opening engagements of the Brody-Dubno battle revealed both the potential of Soviet armored forces and the profound challenges they faced in realizing it. The stage was set for the escalation that would follow in the coming days. As both the escalation of the Brody-Dubno battle unfolded between 27 June and 30 June 1941, as both Soviet and German commands poured additional resources into the struggle. What had begun as a German breakthrough attempt and a Soviet counterstroke rapidly grew into a massive armored clash spread across nearly 300 kilometers of front. The Soviets committed 5 mechanized corps with more than 2,500 tanks into repeated assaults, while Kleist's 1st Panzer Group fought to preserve momentum with roughly 600 operational tanks, heavily supported by motorized infantry and the Luftwaffe. The escalation was marked by increasingly desperate attacks, severe casualties, and the collapse of Soviet coordination under the strain of battle. Soviet command decisions reflected Stalin's rigid directive to hold the frontier. Stavka insisted that the Kirponos, commander of the front, and his chief of staff, Mikhail Perkayev, attempted to synchronize the efforts of the 8th, 9th, 15th, 19th, and 22nd Mechanized Corps. Orders called for converging attacks to encircle Kleist's panzer divisions near Dubno. In theory, the plan mirrored German encirclement methods, seeking to trap enemy armor in a pincer. In practice, logistical breakdowns and shattered communications ensured that these attacks reached the battlefield at different times and places, rarely coordinating to achieve decisive results. By 28 June, the heaviest fighting centered around Dubno and Brody. Soviet forces launched massed assaults, often with brigades of T-34 and KV-1 tanks, leading columns of lighter T-26 and BT machines. In some engagements, Soviet armor broke through German forward lines, forcing panzer regiments to retreat several kilometers. One Soviet report claimed that a KV-1 withstood dozens of hits. However, these local successes could not be sustained. German 80-kilometer flak guns, concentrated artillery, and Stuka dive bombers systematically destroyed advancing columns. Without infantry and artillery support, Soviet tanks often became isolated and encircled. Casualties rose sharply during this phase. Soviet corps lost hundreds of tanks within days, not only to enemy fire but also to mechanical breakdown and fuel shortages. In the 8th Mechanized Corps alone, nearly half of its 900 tanks were destroyed or abandoned by the end of June. The 15th Mechanized Corps lost more than 500 tanks in a similar period, many immobilized on the battlefield for lack of fuel. German losses were also significant. In some divisions, up to a third of tanks were temporarily disabled by combat or mechanical issues, though German repair units were able to return many to service. Estimates suggest that by 29 June, both sides together had lost more than 2,000 tanks, making Brody-Dubno one of the most destructive armored engagements of the early war. Terrain and weather compounded the difficulties. The fighting occurred in a region of rolling fields, forests, and rivers where road networks were limited. Heavy rains during late June turned dirt roads into mud, hampering both Soviet and German supply convoys. Soviet units, advancing long distances from depots, often ran out of fuel in the middle of combat. Tanks were abandoned by their crews and left behind. German units, advancing shorter distances but dependent on captured Soviet fuel, also experienced shortages. This logistical strain slowed the tempo of operations and left both sides vulnerable to sudden counterblows. Civilians suffered directly from the escalation. Towns such as Brody-Dubno, and Lutsk were bombed, shelled. Villages caught between the lines were destroyed in artillery barrages or set alight during German scorched earth operations. Thousands of civilians fled eastward, creating streams of refugees that clogged roads already crowded with retreating Soviet troops and advancing German columns. The chaos contributed to Soviet supply breakdowns as transport routes were blocked and depots lost. Politically, the escalation intensified tensions within both commands. In the Soviet Union, Stalin demanded explanations for the failure to stop Kleist's advance despite the massive numerical superiority in tanks. Kirponos and his subordinates sent repeated reports describing fuel shortages, mechanical failures, and air attacks, but these explanations were met with orders for further counterattacks. On the German side, commanders within Army Group South expressed concern that the Soviet armored resistance was stronger than expected. Kleist warned that his panzers were being worn down in constant combat, but higher command insisted that the advance toward Kiev continue without pause. The morale of soldiers reflected the intensity of the struggle. Soviet crews often entered battle with determination, but repeated defeats and catastrophic losses eroded confidence. Entire brigades were reduced to remnants within days. German troops, though buoyed by their ability to repel numerically superior forces, were shocked by the resilience of Soviet counterattacks and the performance of the T-34 and KV-1. Many German reports acknowledged that these tanks were superior to most of their own models in armor and firepower, requiring improvisation and concentration of heavy weapons to counter. By the end of June, the escalation phase had consumed both sides. The Soviets, despite enormous losses, still sought to mount further counterattacks. The Germans, though battered, maintained cohesion and control of the battlefield, slowly pushing eastward toward Rovno and Zhytomyr. The crisis for the Soviet Southwestern Front deepened as its mechanized corps were bled white, leaving infantry armies exposed to encirclement. The escalation at Brody-Dubno thus turned into a war of attrition that the Soviets could not afford, but which the Germans could not ignore. The crisis of late June revealed the limits of both Soviet mechanized strength and German offensive capacity. For the Soviets, numerical advantage was squandered by poor planning, logistics, and fragmented execution. For the Germans, tactical superiority could not obscure the vulnerability of their panzers to the new Soviet designs and the immense strain on their resources. The escalation of the battle underscored the brutality of armored warfare on the Eastern Front and foreshadowed the even larger clashes that lay ahead. The peak of the Battle of Brody-Dubno came between 29 June and 1 July 1941, when the scale of the confrontation reached its highest intensity. By this stage, nearly all 5 Soviet mechanized corps of the Southwestern Front had entered the battle, committing what remained of their armored strength in a desperate attempt to repel Kleist's 1st Panzer Group. The fighting concentrated along the triangle of Brody, Dubno, and Lutsk, with local engagements spreading across dozens of villages and highways. The battle was fluid, chaotic, and devastating, involving thousands of tanks in simultaneous clashes across a vast area. On the Soviet side, the 8th Mechanized Corps under Dmitry Ryabyshev, initially one of the strongest with 900 tanks, was severely depleted after days of combat. Still, it pressed on with attacks against the German 11th Panzer Division near Brody. The 15th Mechanized Corps under Ignatiy Karpezo, despite catastrophic losses in earlier days, renewed assaults with what remained of its armor, including small numbers of T-34s and KV-1s that continued to cause problems for German anti-tank defenses. Rokossovsky's 9th Mechanized Corps, positioned further north, attempted to push south toward Dubno to link with Ryabyshev, creating a potential encirclement of German spearheads. Meanwhile, the 19th and 22nd Mechanized Corps struck from the east and southeast, seeking to cut German supply lines and isolate forward panzer units. The Soviet plan, at least on paper, represented one of the largest counteroffensives of the early war, 5 corps converging to encircle Kleist's panzers. In reality, coordination was virtually non-existent. Orders were delayed, fuel shortages immobilized many units, and corps often attacked alone without knowledge of neighboring operations. German divisions, though numerically inferior, exploited these gaps to defeat each Soviet assault in detail. The 11th and 16th Panzer Divisions, supported by the 25th Motorized Infantry Division, held defensive lines, counterattacked when opportunities arose, and relied heavily on air support from the Luftwaffe. Air superiority played a decisive role in this phase. The Luftwaffe, having destroyed much of the Soviet Air Force on the ground in the opening days of Barbarossa, was able to concentrate its squadrons over the Brody-Dubno sector. Stuka dive bombers attacked Soviet tank columns and convoys relentlessly, often turning massed assaults into chaotic routes. Soviet mechanized corps, moving in daylight across open terrain, became easy targets. Fuel convoys and repair units were decimated, further crippling Soviet ability to sustain operations. Many tank crews on the ground, the peak of combat, produced massive tank engagements. Near Dubno on 29 June, elements of the 19th Mechanized Corps launched a charge involving over 200 tanks, including T-34s, directly against the 16th Panzer Division. In fierce fighting, Soviet armor penetrated German forward positions and inflicted significant losses, but without infantry or artillery support, they were gradually isolated. German 80mm guns and concentrated anti-tank fire methodically destroyed the attackers. The battlefield was left littered with burning wrecks, testimony to both Soviet determination and German tactical cohesion. The heaviest Soviet losses occurred not only from combat, but also from mechanical attrition. Of the thousands of tanks committed, a significant portion were obsolete T-26s and BT series, prone to breakdowns under the strain of long marches and combat. Spare parts were lacking, and repair battalions were overwhelmed. In some corps, as many as half the tanks were lost to non-combat causes, abandoned when they could not be repaired or refueled. German reports noted capturing hundreds of intact tanks that had simply run out of fuel. For civilians in the contested towns, the peak of the battle was catastrophic. Dubno and Brody changed hands multiple times as Soviet and German forces surged back and forth. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed by artillery and bombing raids. Civilians attempting to flee eastward found themselves caught in the midst of tank battles, their villages reduced to ruins. The scorched landscape of burning tanks, destroyed convoys, and shattered towns became a grim backdrop for one of the fiercest armored clashes of 1941. At the command level, both sides faced critical decisions. Kirponos and his staff continued to order counterattacks despite mounting losses, fearing the consequences of allowing Kleist to advance unchecked toward Kyiv. Stalin himself demanded that resistance be pressed at all costs. On the German side, Kleist reported that his divisions were heavily engaged and suffering significant attrition. Requests for reinforcement and rest were denied. The drive toward Kyiv could not be delayed. German commanders, though confident in their tactical superiority, recognized that Soviet resistance was far stronger than anticipated. By 30th of June, the Mechanized Corps were nearing exhaustion. The 8th Mechanized Corps had fewer than 100 operational tanks remaining. The 15th Corps was virtually destroyed. Rokossovsky's 9th Corps retained some combat strength, but was increasingly isolated. The 19th and 22nd Corps, having advanced into German rear areas, now faced encirclement themselves as German units counterattacked. In total, Soviet forces had committed. German losses were smaller, several hundred tanks disabled or destroyed, but their divisions remained operational, able to continue the advance. The peak of the Brody-Dubno battle thus revealed the full scope of Soviet determination and the limits of its execution in 1941. Despite unprecedented numbers, Soviet mechanized corps were unable to achieve their objectives, undone by poor coordination, logistical collapse, and German combined arms superiority. For the Wehrmacht, the ability to withstand such massive assaults confirmed the effectiveness of its doctrine, but it also revealed the challenges posed by the new Soviet tanks and the scale of resistance it would face in the East. As July began, the The Soviet mechanized counteroffensive collapsed into scattered fighting retreats. The Germans, bloodied but victorious, secured their path toward Rovno and Zhytomyr. The peak of the campaign ended with Soviet armored forces shattered, German momentum preserved, and the wider encirclements of Soviet armies in Ukraine looming. The Brody-Dubno battle had reached its climax, and in its aftermath lay both devastation and lessons that would shape the conduct of future armored warfare on the Eastern Front. As July 1941 began, the shattered remains of the Soviet Mechanized Corps struggled to regroup and adapt to the relentless German advance. The resistance phase of the Brody-Dubno battle was defined not by sweeping maneuvers or massed armored charges, but by improvised defensive stands, scattered counterattacks, and desperate efforts to slow the Wehrmacht long enough for the Southwestern Front to establish a new line east of the battlefield. Though the Soviet counteroffensive had failed to achieve its strategic aim of halting Kleist's 1st Panzer Group, it had not. Instead, isolated units, rear guards, and small groups of surviving tanks continued to resist, buying time with localized actions that bore little resemblance to the grand plans of late June. The surviving elements of the 8th Mechanized Corps under Dmitry Ryabyshev were pulled back to reconstitute near Tarnopol after losing more than 600 tanks in a week. With fewer than 100 machines left operational, Ryabyshev focused on maintaining cohesion among his exhausted men rather than mounting new offensives. The 15th Mechanized Corps, devastated by airstrikes and encirclements, ceased to exist as an organized formation. Its remnants were absorbed into nearby armies as ad hoc units. Rokossovsky's 9th Mechanized Corps, still retaining some T-34s and KV-1s, proved more resilient. Rokossovsky withdrew his forces methodically, regrouping around Rovno to delay German spearheads with His disciplined leadership, though unable to reverse the tide, ensured that his corps retained combat value long after others had been reduced to fragments. The 19th and 22nd Mechanized Corps, which had attempted to strike into German rear areas, now faced the consequences of overextension. Their attacks lacked coordination with neighboring units, and when German divisions counterattacked with concentrated armor and air support, these corps were trapped in exposed positions. Hundreds of tanks were destroyed or abandoned. Survivors retreated eastward in small groups, harassed constantly by Luftwaffe strafing and by German mobile detachments cutting roads. By early July, the Southwestern Front's once vast armored strength had been reduced to a fraction of its paper total. Despite the catastrophic losses, Soviet commanders sought to adapt. Local counterattacks were still ordered, often carried out by small detachments of 10. These actions, while unable to alter the operational situation, forced German panzers to fight continually, slowing their rate of advance. In some cases, Soviet tankers ambushed German supply convoys, destroying fuel trucks and buying a few precious hours of delay. Even isolated KV-1s, when deployed defensively in villages or forests, could hold up German columns until flak guns or concentrated artillery were brought forward. German records reflect frustration at the persistence of Soviet resistance. Though Kleist's divisions continued to advance toward Rovno and Zhytomyr, progress was slower than the rapid breakthroughs seen in the northern and central sectors of Barbarossa. The 16th Panzer Division, for example, reported repeated clashes with small groups of Soviet tanks, which inflicted unexpected losses before being destroyed. Supply difficulties added to the strain. Fuel shortages, damaged bridges, and ambushed convoys forced German commanders to devote resources to securing their rear areas. The image of an unstoppable armored spearhead concealed the reality of constant attrition and improvisation. For civilians, the resistance phase meant ongoing suffering. As villages changed hands or became battlegrounds, residents endured bombardment, requisitions, and reprisals. Some locals assisted Soviet units by guiding them through forests or hiding survivors, while others, under German occupation, were forced into labor or punished for suspected partisan activity. Refugee streams continued eastward, complicating Soviet logistics as roads were choked with civilians fleeing the front. The psychological toll on both armies was profound. For Soviet troops, the collapse of entire mechanized corps within days created despair, but also hardened determination among those who survived. Accounts describe tank crews fighting to the last shell before destroying their vehicles to prevent capture. German soldiers, while buoyed by overall success, became increasingly aware that Soviet resistance would not collapse easily. Reports noted the strength of the T-34 and KV-1, the resilience of Soviet troops under fire, and the sheer scale of forces committed, raising questions about the assumption that the campaign would be won within weeks. Innovation also emerged amid desperation. Soviet commanders experimented with dispersing tanks into smaller groups rather than concentrating them in corps-sized assaults, increasing their survivability against Luftwaffe airstrikes. Infantry units improvised anti-tank defenses with Molotov cocktails, mines, and artillery fire coordinated against advancing panzers. German units in turn refined their use of combined arms, ensuring that every armored push was supported by close air support, mobile artillery, and engineers equipped to clear obstacles. By 2nd July, the organized Soviet counteroffensive had effectively ended. The Southwestern Front no longer possessed the strength to mount corps-level armored operations. Instead, its resistance relied on piecemeal actions, delaying tactics, and the gradual withdrawal of infantry armies toward the Dnieper, yet these actions, though costly, bought crucial time. German panzers, slowed by constant resistance and attrition, did not reach Kiev as quickly as their northern counterparts reached Smolensk. This delay allowed the Red Army to reinforce the central sector and prepare defenses along the Dnieper, shaping the wider course of the campaign. The resistance and adaptation phase of the Brody-Dubno battle thus highlighted the resilience of Soviet forces even in defeat. Their mechanized corps, shattered as large formations, nevertheless left behind a legacy of determined local resistance and the first demonstration that German armored thrusts could be contested, if not yet decisively stopped. For the Wehrmacht, the battle provided valuable experience in countering the T-34 and KV-1, foreshadowing the technical and tactical adaptations that would follow. Both sides emerged bloodied, their perceptions of the war altered by one of the largest and most brutal tank clashes of 1941. The turning point of the Brody-Dubno battle came in the final days of June and the beginning of July 1941, when it became evident that the Soviet mechanized counteroffensive could no longer achieve its objectives. The initial hope of encircling or halting Kleist's 1st Panzer Group faded as corps after corps was worn down by attrition. German forces, though heavily engaged in suffering their own losses, retained operational cohesion, while Soviet units were fragmented, short of fuel, and often operating without reliable communication or supplies. One of the critical factors was the loss of Soviet command coordination. Orders from Kirponos's southwestern front to his mechanized corps arrived late or were contradicted by rapidly changing battlefield conditions. Rokossovsky later recalled how his 9th Mechanized Corps received orders to counterattack only after the Germans had already shifted their axis of advance. Instead of delivering a concentrated strike, Soviet corps launched disconnected attacks, allowing German divisions to meet and defeat them sequentially. By 30 June, the grand encirclement envisioned by Stavka had devolved into a series of uncoordinated battles that drained Soviet strength. German divisions seized the initiative at this stage. The 11th and 16th Panzer Divisions, supported by the 25th Motorized Infantry Division, conducted counterattacks that cut off advancing Soviet units, isolating brigades and regiments. At Dubno, Soviet tanks briefly penetrated deep into German positions, but without supply or infantry support, they were surrounded and destroyed. South of Brody, the 8th and 15th Mechanized Corps, already reduced to fragments, were pushed back toward Tarnopol. Soviet forces that had advanced into German rear areas were trapped by mobile counterblows and eliminated. Air power further solidified the German advantage. The Luftwaffe, maintaining air superiority throughout the battle, struck Soviet columns attempting to regroup or withdraw. Tank parks, supply convoys, and road junctions became targets for concentrated bombing, preventing Soviet units from reconstituting. German commanders emphasized the role of airstrikes in breaking Soviet morale, as columns dispersed under bombardment and fuel shortages worsened. Casualty figures underline the scale of the turning point. Between 24 June and 1 July, the Soviet Southwestern Front lost more than 2,000 tanks destroyed or abandoned. Many were not lost to enemy fire, but to mechanical breakdowns or lack of fuel. In contrast, Kleist's 1st Panzer Group reported several hundred tanks temporarily disabled but restored to service by repair units. The disparity revealed the effectiveness of German logistical organization compared to the overstretched Soviet system. For civilians in the contested zone, the turning point meant that German occupation was inevitable. As Soviet forces withdrew eastward, towns like Dubno and Brody fell under German control. Civilians were left to face reprisals, requisitions, and the destruction left by days of fields were littered with wrecked machines, many still burning, while villages were scarred by artillery and aerial bombardment. The broader repercussions of the turning point were significant. For the Soviets, the destruction of their mechanized corps in western Ukraine meant that the Southwestern Front no longer possessed armored reserves capable of major counteroffensives. Infantry armies remained, but without tank support, they were vulnerable to encirclement. For the Germans, the successful containment and destruction of Soviet armor confirmed their ability to maintain momentum despite numerical inferiority. Yet the cost and intensity of the fighting also revealed that Soviet resistance was stronger than anticipated, a lesson that foreshadowed the long struggle to come. By early July, the battle was no longer a contest of equal armored forces. The Soviets had lost the capacity to strike back in strength, and the Wehrmacht had regained freedom of maneuver. The turning point at Brody-Dubno marked the collapse of the Soviet counteroffensive and ensured that the road to Kiev remained open for Army Group South. It was a moment when Soviet ambition gave way to harsh reality, shaping the next phase of the campaign in Ukraine. By the first days of July 1941, the Battle of Brody-Dubno had shifted decisively in favor of the Wehrmacht. The Soviet counteroffensive, conceived as a massive pincer designed to halt and even encircle Kleist's 1st Panzer Group, had exhausted itself. What followed was the grim aftermath, as Soviet mechanized formations attempted to withdraw or regroup, only to suffer further losses under relentless German pursuit. The destruction of Soviet armored strength in this battle cleared the way for the withdrawal of Soviet forces began under chaotic circumstances. By 2nd July, the 8th Mechanized Corps had been reduced from nearly 900 tanks to fewer than 100. The 15th Mechanized Corps, once boasting 700 machines, was virtually annihilated. The 19th and 22nd Mechanized Corps, which had attempted to strike into German rear areas, were cut off and destroyed in piecemeal engagements. Rokossovsky's 9th Mechanized Corps, which had fought more coherently than others, still retained small groups of T-34s and KV-1s, but even these units were now short of fuel and ammunition. The dream of halting the German advance with concentrated armored power had collapsed. What remained was a fighting retreat eastward. German forces pressed their advantage ruthlessly. Kleist's panzer divisions, despite sustaining several hundred tanks disabled in combat, had kept their formations intact and were able to exploit their success. Repair battalions restored many damaged panzers, ensuring that the 1st Panzer Group retained striking power. The 11th and 16th Panzer Divisions drove toward Rovno, while motorized infantry divisions moved to secure Dubno and Brody. Soviet resistance stiffened in places, with rearguard actions conducted by small tank groups or infantry units supported by artillery, but these actions could only delay the inevitable. The Luftwaffe remained a decisive factor during the withdrawal phase. Soviet columns retreating along crowded roads were relentlessly attacked from the air. Bombing raids destroyed bridges, fuel convoys, and retreating vehicles, scattering units and leaving many stranded. Soviet air forces, already devastated in the opening days of Barbarossa, could offer little protection. The dominance of German aircraft meant that even organized retreats turned into routs when struck from the air. Casualty figures during the withdrawal were catastrophic for the Red Army. Of the more than 2,500 tanks committed to the battle, fewer than 800 remained by early July, and many of those were damaged or immobile. The Germans, while acknowledging the destruction of large numbers of Soviet armor, also admitted to losing several hundred panzers, disabled or destroyed. However, the German ability to recover and repair vehicles allowed them to retain effective combat power, while the Soviets lacked the logistical and technical means to restore their losses. In human terms, Soviet mechanized corps reported tens of thousands of casualties, including killed, wounded, and missing. Many formations ceased to exist as coherent units. Civilians in the region endured severe consequences as the front shifted eastward. With Soviet forces retreating, many villages and towns were left defenseless. German occupation authorities and advancing troops imposed requisitions of food and livestock, while local populations faced harsh reprisals for suspected partisan activity. The devastation of days of tank battles left the countryside littered with wrecks and corpses, while burned-out towns like Dubno bore witness to the ferocity of the fighting. For many civilians, the aftermath meant the beginning of a long and brutal occupation. Politically, the withdrawal highlighted the failure of Soviet pre-war planning. Stalin's insistence on counterattacks at the frontier had resulted in the destruction of the Red Army's most powerful mechanized corps without halting the enemy advance. Reports sent to Stavka detailed the catastrophic losses, but commanders were instructed to continue resistance at all costs. The defeat at Brody-Dubno was overshadowed in official accounts by subsequent events, such as the encirclement battles at Smolensk and Kiev, but it represented one of the most costly defeats of the opening phase of Barbarossa. For the Germans, the aftermath of Brody-Dubno reinforced their confidence in the feasibility of the campaign. The destruction of thousands of Soviet tanks in less than 2 weeks confirmed, in their view, the superiority of German tactics, doctrine, and coordination. Yet within the Wehrmacht, some officers noted the alarming performance of the T-34 and KV-1, which had resisted conventional anti-tank weapons. Although defeated by combined arms tactics, these tanks left a lasting impression and spurred urgent efforts to develop heavier German designs. The battle was thus both a triumph and a warning for the Wehrmacht. At the operational level, the withdrawal left the Soviet southwestern front weakened and vulnerable. With its mechanized corps destroyed, Kirponos had little to counter the continuing German advance toward Kiev. Infantry armies alone could not stop encirclement operations without armored support. The path was now open for Army Group South to begin the series of maneuvers that would culminate in the massive encirclement at Kiev later that summer. The immediate consequences of the withdrawal were grim. Soviet forces retreated eastward in disarray, leaving behind wrecked equipment and prisoners. German divisions advanced rapidly, capturing Rovno and pushing toward Zhytomyr. The destruction of the Soviet mechanized counteroffensive also eliminated any possibility of halting Army Group southwest of the Dnieper. For the Red Army, the Brody-Dubno battle was a warning of the enormous challenges that lay ahead in 1941. Without better coordination, logistics, and training, even numerical superiority in tanks could not guarantee success. By the time the guns fell silent around Brody and Dubno, the battlefield was a graveyard of machines and men. Soviet corps had been annihilated, German divisions bloodied but victorious, and the course of the campaign in Ukraine decisively shaped. The aftermath was not simply a Soviet defeat, but the destruction of an entire armored counteroffensive that had once promised to alter the trajectory of Barbarossa. Instead, it cleared the way for the Wehrmacht to continue its advance, leaving behind a devastated land and a shattered Red Army struggling to recover. The legacy of the Battle of Brody-Dubno has often been overshadowed by later and more famous clashes of armored forces, such as Stalingrad and Kursk. Yet its scale and consequences make it one of the most significant battles of the opening weeks of Operation Barbarossa. It was the first time that the Red Army committed its newly created mechanized corps in massive numbers, and the result revealed both the potential and the severe limitations of Soviet armored warfare in 1941. Militarily, the battle demonstrated that numerical superiority alone could not. The Soviets fielded more than 2,500 tanks, many of them modern T-34s and KV-1s, against roughly 600 panzers of Kleist's 1st Panzer Group. Yet despite this advantage, the mechanized corps suffered catastrophic losses, with over two-thirds of their strength destroyed or abandoned. The reasons lay in systemic weaknesses. Most Soviet tanks were obsolete models like the T-26 and BT series, prone to breakdowns, while fuel shortages and Luftwaffe air supremacy left even advanced tanks stranded. The German use of radios in nearly all their vehicles, disciplined combined arms tactics, and effective logistics allowed them to prevail despite being outnumbered. For the German army, Brody-Dubno reinforced confidence in blitzkrieg methods, proving that well-coordinated mechanized operations supported by air power could overcome larger enemy forces. Yet it also exposed vulnerabilities. German commanders were startled by the resilience of Soviet defenses and the quality of the T-34, whose sloped armor and 76mm gun outclassed most German tanks. Though the Wehrmacht succeeded, it was not without cost. Hundreds of their panzers were disabled, and the campaign revealed that future battles would not be decided by easy breakthroughs alone. The recognition of Soviet industrial and technical capacity prompted accelerated German tank development, eventually leading to designs like the Panther. Politically and strategically, the consequences for the Soviet Union were immense. The destruction of the mechanized corps west of Kiev eliminated the Southwestern Front's ability to conduct large-scale counteroffensives. This left the infantry armies exposed and paved the way for the encirclement battles at Uman and Kiev later in the summer of 1941. The loss of Ukraine's armored shield also meant that the defense of the Dnieper line would be far weaker. In broader terms, the defeat undermined Stalin's insistence on holding the frontier at all costs. But the lesson was learned only after more disasters. For the Red Army, the battle forced a re-evaluation of armored doctrine. The mechanized corps structure, unwieldy and logistically unsustainable, was disbanded in the aftermath of these early defeats. Smaller, more flexible tank brigades replaced them, capable of easier coordination with infantry and artillery. Though this transition was born of necessity, it laid the groundwork for the eventual resurgence of Soviet armored power, culminating in the massive offensives of 1943-1945. Brody-Dubno thus stands as both a tragic loss and a painful learning experience that shaped Soviet military evolution. Culturally and historically, the battle became a largely forgotten episode, overshadowed by later victories that the Soviet state chose to emphasize in wartime propaganda and post-war commemoration. Unlike Kursk, which was celebrated as a turning point, Brody-Dubno symbolized the disastrous opening of the war, a moment when Soviet strength in numbers was squandered. Yet for those who fought there, the battle was remembered as a trial of endurance, where crews of T-34s and KV-1s fought against overwhelming odds, and where German soldiers first realized the scale of the enemy they faced. In historical debate, Brody-Dubno is often referred to as a prelude to Kursk. It showed in miniature many of the dynamics that would later characterize the great tank battles of the Eastern Front. Massive deployments, the clash of doctrines, the importance of logistics and air support, and the pivotal role of armored design. But unlike Kursk, which ended in Soviet success, Brody-Dubno ended in devastating Soviet defeat. Its significance lies not in triumph, but in the lessons extracted, about the necessity of coordination, the limits of numbers, and the emerging contest between German and Soviet industrial capacities. Ultimately, the legacy of the battle is twofold. For the Wehrmacht, it confirmed their operational dominance in the summer of 1941, yet it also served as an early warning that the Soviet Union could not be defeated quickly. For the Red Army, it was a catastrophe that highlighted the unpreparedness of its forces, but also marked the beginning of adaptation. In the wreckage of thousands of tanks and the loss of tens of thousands of men, the Soviet command began to grasp the realities of modern armored warfare. The forgotten tank battle at Brody-Dubno remains one of the defining episodes of the first phase of the war in the East, a brutal lesson in both the promise and the peril of mechanized conflict on an unprecedented scale.